Hello, everybody, and welcome to this stream. I hope that it is working all right. Go ahead and let me know if you can hear everything all right. I did do a little audio test before, but I want to make sure. Hello to Deniz and to Derek in the YouTube chat. Yes, I can see you. Derek says, hey, I don't know if you read this chat, but I've been watching your stuff a while now and it's helped me immensely. You are a great teacher. What's the best way to donate? Hey, thank you very much. That's very encouraging. You know, at this point, I mean, even though, teaching, lifelong learning, sharing that's like a passion, and that's my lifelong project. It's not the main thing I'm doing. I'm trying to write a book, and obviously that's related, but the most of my work is just work, just working under capitalism, grinding under capitalism, and trying to stay focused on the things that really matter. And so when I actually get an opportunity to do a stream like this, it's just like I really look forward to it. But, it requires like push, I have to eke out the time and all of that. And so I was like, when am I going to do a stream again? And then I actually had to be reading Wage, Labor, and Capital already because I'm doing a presentation on it in an organization that I'm in. And so I thought, oh my goodness, what a perfect opportunity to do another live assisted reading. We'll get a little bit more into why this is a classic text, probably one that if you were not already familiar with, you will be coming back to. And even if you have already heard of it, then you probably are coming back to it and excited more than ever because you know what's in store. But before we get into all of that, the little thing about the donations. Yeah, Derek. So what you just said. Oh my God. So DDD is a person who I don't think is in the chat right now, but might be in a little bit. I don't know. Who knows? Maybe they're already here. But last time they donated $50 and then they accidentally donated it 3 times in a row. And I still haven't figured out how to get it back to them because there was this weird thing with the programming side of my website where wires got crossed and the money that was supposed to go to me went to someone else who my programmer programs for. And then that person also just happens to be my brother Rivera, who also has a YouTube channel. And so Rivera had been getting all these donations and subscriptions and thought that they were going to him for the work that he was doing. And then it's been confusing, but he's more than eager to get me back my money, but I've just been so busy I haven't been able to get it all sorted out. And so DDD, I will get you reimbursed for those 2 extra donations. I really hope that money was not needed for rent or something that weekend or something like that, because now it's been a little bit. All right. Now, with that said, though, you can donate still. I mean, I guess at this point it doesn't matter. So you can donate at theorypleeb.com/donate or at patreon.com/theorypleeb. Or there's also some links in the description on the YouTube videos that I do to Cash and Venmo apps. And, and basically every one of those is by request. I've had people specifically say, can you put a Venmo link there? I only use Venmo. I don't use PayPal. Oh, I don't use this. I don't. So I try to have it all there. That's my virtual hat. You can put money in. But anyway, enough with my grifting. Let's get back to the topic at hand. I wanted to talk a little bit about what really matters about this text and how this video is going to go about unpacking it and why. So, Wage, Labor, and Capital by Karl Marx, the bearded fellow in the thumbnail, is a text that was published in 1849, I believe, and it was published in a newspaper. And he wrote it to be understandable to workers. Now, the workers of his day were more literate than the workers of our day, but nevertheless, at least when it comes to the written word. And so, it's still a bit above my head at times, and I'm sure it will be above many of your heads. And so we're going to take it. I said speedrun in the YouTube title. I said that we're speedrunning this text, just playing off of the video game thing where, someone speedruns a video game that they've basically mastered and they try to finish it in record time. Now, this isn't really going to be like, I'm not rushing my way through it, but we're going to see how much we can get out of it in one single go. We'll probably finish reading it all at once. I did this with a strange labor. I did this with a strange labor already, which is another classic early Marx writing. I've done it with some other things besides Marx's stuff too. Marx is not the only philosopher I read on this channel, but I am in a Marxist organization, and so for that reason, he kind of comes up a lot in my life. I'm also studying alongside the Platypus Society with their syllabus, and so that's also got a lot of Marx in it. And so anyway, Wage, Labor, and Capital should be interesting and valuable to you even if you aren't a Marxist. It should be interesting even if you are just a liberal or an average everyday conservative. It doesn't really matter where you're coming from. If you're a complete non-political person in your own, at least in your own self-conception, don't consider yourself political, then I think that there will be a lot here for you. And especially if you're into philosophy or economics, not just historically, but because primary classic works that inform your field, whether it's philosophy or economics or science, those primary classic works always give you a stronger basis in the field and give you a sense for how that field is formed. And the nice thing about Wage, Labor, and Capital is that it is Marx's first attempt to speak systematically in the most accessible terms possible for workers, and to articulate the way that capitalism works as a system and the way that that impacts workers. So in earlier works like the 1844 manuscripts, such as Estranged Labor, he was sorting this stuff out in his own head. Those were never published during his lifetime. He wasn't writing those for a lay audience or for a non-professional philosopher audience. And so there is, this kind of big gap between writing for clarity and just to figure out what oneself is thinking, right? And then there is writing for an audience once you figured it out. And right now I'm in the middle of my book, so I'm running into this issue where it's like I am so torn in writing styles and I don't really know how to proceed, because I can definitely write this in a way where it's just like I'm thinking it through for myself, trying to make myself clear as I go. But to come along the other side and just present what you've already thought through, I'm not there yet. That's a tall order. So when people hear you use some big words and then they say, oh, you need to, or it sounds convoluted or complex or compound sentences and whatever, that they might say, oh, you need to figure out how to explain that to a fifth grader. Yep, been trying now for 10 years. Get off it. It's not easy. So that's the goal, but we ain't there yet. And so anyway, but this is basically that. This is, hey, Izul, good to see you. Hey, Watcher, good to see you. Is Stirner based? I don't know. I think probably people I know who are pretty based like Stirner. That's all I can say. Whenever I hear about Stirner, it just makes me think about other stuff that I read. So it's like, it just seems kind of like, he seems kind of like everything that people say they get out of Stirner, I already get from Levinas and from Nietzsche and from Marx. So it's like Stirner sounds kind of like a mixture of those three, even though he was before a couple of them. So was he before Nietzsche? Probably simultaneous. I don't know. Anyway, doesn't matter. There's actually a recent book, All Things Are Nothing to Me, from Zero Books, which read Stirner for socialism. This is such a, wow, I'm getting derailed. All right, I want to get back to the topic right now. So I wanted to talk a little bit about, now that we've talked about the money issues on this on my website and getting that figured out, I want to say a thing about how this video is going to be done. So my analytics show me that people only watch this for about like a half hour on average. So who do I have in mind when I'm making this video? Who is the audience? It's not just the people who are watching right now, because I'm doing this live stream in a way where it is meant to be gone back to later. What I hope is that someone who is watching this after the fact will timestamp the section headers. Up here on screen, you can see there's section headers in the table of contents for introduction, preliminary, what are wages, etc. And so we'll have section headers for all of those, hopefully. And then people will be able to come back. So like if they're reading this in the future and they have, if they want to hear someone else trying to think through what it says in like the section on the relation of wage labor to capital, let's just say they want to go into that specific section, there will be a timestamp and make that really easy for them so they don't have to watch this whole video. But at the same time, this whole video will be something that is meant to become, it's meant to be returned to. Okay, so that's part of the goal here. Most live streams are not done with the intention of being returned to, and even if they're done with the intention of being posted later, they're not necessarily posted later as an educational resource that could potentially be incorporated into some broader course structure as a module on a specific text. And yes, I am thinking about doing stuff like that. Once again, we ain't there yet. All right. So also I'm dropping frames. I realize that, but just be aware that you can turn down the resolution. That was something Anarchist Tech Support suggested last time, and that's a good idea. So turn down the resolution if you're having skipping issues. Hopefully it's only a visual thing, and I really do hope that it's not going to be an audio issue where I'm cutting in and out. That would be a big pain. But all right. So all right. Anything else we got to do before we jump in? I think that we're almost ready. I'm going to look at my theorypleeb.com/live chat, and it looks like Manatomi is in there, and they said finally caught a stream, and they did a Pepe hands up. I'm not doing chat on screen because it would be too distracting. So we're just going to be reading from this, and I will unpack as we go. Keep in mind that I'm unpacking from time to time. It means that I could read 3 sentences or 2 paragraphs without unpacking, you know, every step of the way. I might just kind of get to a point where I then kind of summarize. And sometimes when I say a word that is not very well known, I might throw in some extra words to kind of like synonyms or kind of a quick characterization of what those words mean. And so I'm trying to make it more accessible, and that's the whole point of calling it an assisted reading. The goal is that you could come back to this in the future when you need to tackle wage, labor, and capital for whatever reason, and you could play a video game while listening to me unpack it, and you won't just get lost in the monotony of a single narrator voice reading it, because it will be broken up by the interjections and elaborations of me, the plebe. So I hope that you get something out of it, and if you don't, fucking who cares, because I'm gonna get something out of this, because I guarantee you, if you want to get a lot out of a text, read it on stream. The reading it in advance, preparing to read it on stream is a more kind of serious, like you're paying more attention because you realize that you're going to be in that spotlight. And so this kind of like exegesis thing is definitely not just something that people in the comment section sometimes say they appreciate. It's also something that I get a lot out of. And so I appreciate you all for being here, for making it possible. And with that, let's dive in. I'm going to read the introduction by Frederick Engels here. Really quick note about this is that the link to right here, it's just Marxist.org archive, but you can, the link is in the YouTube description, so go ahead and check that out if you want to read along. If it's on screen, I hope you can see, I hope the words are big enough for you. If you're on your little tiny phone, I'm not really sure how that works out. I could technically make it bigger, but then it'll mess up the proportions of this setup. So let me know if you do need it to be bigger. But anyway, you know what? I could zoom in a little bit. There we go. Okay. Now, this is where the first timestamp would go. Introduction to Karl Marx's Wage, Labor, and Capital by Frederick Engels. This pamphlet first appeared in the form of a series of leading articles in the New Rheinische Zeitung, which means newspaper, beginning on April 4th, 1849. The text is made up from lectures delivered by Marx from the German Working Men's Club of Brussels in 1847. The series was never completed. The promise to be continued at the end of the editorial in number 2 69 of the newspaper remain unfulfilled in consequence of the precipitous events of that time, the shit that went down. The invasion of Hungary by the Russians and the uprisings in Dresden, Iserlohn, Elberfeld, oh gosh, there's a lot of these, I don't know, the Palatinate, and in Baden, which led to the suppression of the paper on May 19th, 1849. And among the papers left by Marx, no manuscript of any continuation of these articles has been found. So just the gist of this very beginning is just to say, he didn't finish this because if you've seen the young Karl Marx, when, he's like in that space working with other people talking, I think Sterner might have been one of the people that was up there actually, and they're working on their newspaper, and then I think the constables or whatever come knocking down their doors and trying to arrest them or whatever, and they get chased out of the country. That kind of stuff was happening from time to time because Marx was a bit of a rebel rouser. And so that's all that they're saying, is that one of these times that he was chased out, it fucked up his ability to finish writing these manuscripts, but it doesn't matter because he went right back to work on Capital, the 7-volume project of which he only ever published 3 volumes. So I think one or two of those were published after he was dead. So there's a little bit of extra information about those historical events here, but we're not going to dive into it right now. So moving on, Engels says, Wage, Labor, and Capital has appeared as an independent publication in several editions, the last of which was issued by the Swiss Cooperative Printing Association in Huntington, Zurich in 1884. Hitherto, the several editions have contained the exact wording of the original articles. But since at least 10,000 copies of the present edition are to be circulated as a propaganda tract, the question necessarily forces itself upon me. Would Marx himself, under these circumstances, have approved of an unaltered literal reproduction of the original? The answer is no. All he's basically saying is that Marx's work matures a lot after he had written Wage, Labor, and Capital. And so Engels decides that for the purpose of the education of workers and propaganda for communism everywhere, he needed to directly edit Wage, Labor, and Capital. And so I'll summarize this next part. All that he is doing is he's going to focus on specifically the term labor that Marx is using in Wage, Labor, and Capital, and he's going to change it to say labor power, and he's going to add a few sentences here and there to make that make sense, because this is Marx's great discoveries, which I'll get to right here. He says to the reader runs, this pamphlet is not as Marx wrote it in 1849, but approximately as Marx would have written it in 1891. Moreover, so many copies of the original text are in circulation that these will suffice until I can publish it again unaltered in a complete edition. So he does think that it needs to be, the original should be published unaltered, but for the purposes of, education, he wanted to have it be, he needed this distinction in here. And the reason that I am reading the introduction right now is because he kind of gives his explanation for all of these changes that will be within the actual body of the text itself. So he goes right here. He says, my alterations center about 1 point. Okay, 1 point. According to the original reading, the worker sells his labor for wages, which he receives from the capitalist. According to the present text, he sells his labor power. And for this change, I must render an explanation to the workers in order that they may understand that we are not quibbling or word juggling, but are dealing here with one of the most important points in the whole range of political economy. To the bourgeois, in order that they may convince themselves how greatly the uneducated workers, who can be easily made to grasp the most difficult economic analyses, excel our supercilious cultured folk, for whom such ticklish problems remain insoluble their whole life long. So that was basically his way of dunking on people who have academic educations, and kind of just like, oh, what are you talking about? Oh, does that really matter? And they can't wrap their heads around these concepts like labor power that are so based in our everyday working lives that and Marx is Engels is talking up workers, saying workers can make sense of this because they're smarter than people give them credit for, and so. He's saying, though, that he wants to make sure the workers don't think that he's just word quibbling, which is to say he's not just nitpicking. This isn't just some academic semantics or whatever. The term labor power is a really big deal. That's all he's saying right here. And so why is it a big deal? He'll say that now. So classical political economy, so that would be like, it starts with John Locke and moves into Ricardo and Adam Smith and those people. Classical political economy borrowed from the industrial practice the current notion of the manufacturer, that he buys and pays for the labor of his employees. This conception had been quite serviceable for the business purposes of the manufacturer, his bookkeeping and price calculation. But naively carried over into political economy, it there produced truly wonderful errors and confusions. Okay, so this idea that labor is purchased. Okay, you still hear this all the time. People say, that value is labor. All right, well, sort of. Political economy finds it an established fact that the prices of all commodities, among them the price of the commodity which it calls labor, continually change, that they rise and fall in consequence of the most diverse circumstances, which often have no connection whatsoever with the production of the commodities themselves, so that prices appear to be determined as a rule by pure chance, right? So prices in the market always going up and down, moving all over the place, and it just seems like totally like chance, right? So he says, as soon, therefore, as political economy stepped forth as a science, it was one of its first tasks to search for the law that hid itself behind this chance, which apparently determined the prices of commodities, and which in reality controlled this very chance. Among the prices of commodities, fluctuating and oscillating, just meaning the words for going all over the place, now upward, now downward, the fixed central point was searched for, around which these fluctuations and oscillations were taking place, right? Political economy can't call itself a science if it can't explain the causal mechanisms kind of working behind the scenes for the fluctuations and oscillations taking place in the market that determine the prices of everything that one could ever need or want to buy. So if it wants to call itself a science, it's going to have to figure out how to predict prices. In short, starting from the price of commodities, political economy sought for the value of commodities as the regulating law, by means of which all price fluctuations could be explained, and to which they could all be reduced in the last resort. Okay. And so classical political economy found that the value of a commodity was determined by the labor incorporated in it and requisite to its production, right? So this all starts out with John Locke's, original argument for the labor theory of value, which is just that, what gives you the right to an apple over someone else having the right to that apple? He says it's that you picked it. Right? You went to the work, you exerted effort into picking it. So, if you build something, you've added your value into that. It wouldn't even exist without your labor adding value to those natural resources. And so that is the basis for property in political economy. And it's also the basis of value. And, a lot of anarchists would agree with the labor theory of value, and Marx sort of agrees, but there's some caveats. So he says, and so classical economy found that the value of a commodity was determined by the labor incorporated in it and requisite to its production. I already said that. With this explanation, it was satisfied, and we, too, may for the present stop at this point, but to avoid misconceptions, I will remind the reader that today this explanation has become wholly inadequate. Marx was the first to investigate thoroughly into the value-forming quality of labor, and to discover that not all labor, which is apparently or even really necessary to the production of a commodity, imparts under all circumstances to this commodity a magnitude of value corresponding to the quantity of labor used up. Now that is a hefty sentence. Should I actually try to break it down? So Marx was the first one who really tried to figure this out, is what he's saying. And the big discovery is that not all labor necessary to the production of the commodity always adds, of course, like an equivalent measure of value to the product. Okay, it's not just that you put effort into something that adds value to it, because let's just say, for instance, that you are going to wash the windows of someone's house, right? And they're going to pay you to do that. But it took you 10 times as long to wash those windows as someone else. at that point, you're wasting their time. They're wasting your time. There's no way that they can pay you fairly or to compensate the effort that you've put into that. So maybe a better example is like a person, digging trenches. If it takes 100 people, if it takes paying 100 people to dig some trenches that you could just have dug by one person operating a backhoe, those people with those shovels aren't going to be able to compete with that backhoe. So this is where the idea of socially necessary labor time comes in, because there is, depending on your historical phase of development, with where technology is at in your society, what you can do and how your efforts can be valued are going to be measured against how long it takes others on average. And if some others on average have the machines or the means of production to be able to produce the goods or services that others are doing, but like in half the time and at half the cost, then that is going to become like the new standard, right? And so that's you will either rise or fall to the occasion against that standard, which is the socially average necessary amount of labor time put into something. That measure is set by the level of the means of production. Now, if none of that made sense, don't worry, we'll come back to it. I hope it did. Good old pausing every 20 seconds. Okay, Half Truth, good to see you. Again, you were here last time, I remember. Yeah, go to YouTube and maybe on Twitch you can do it. You can probably turn down the resolution. That might help. So, if therefore we say today, in short, with economists like Ricardo, that the value of a commodity is determined by the labor necessary to its production, we always imply the reservations or restrictions made by Marx. Thus, much of our present purpose. Further information can be found in Marx's Critique of Political Economy, which appeared in 1859, and in the first volume of Capital. Right. Now he's going to dive into a bit more of an explanation of how it all works, and I find this really useful. But another quick word, if you're hopping into the stream at this point on YouTube or on my personal website, theorypleeb.com/live, you should be able to go back to the beginning and fast forward if you missed opening stuff and you want that. But I'll keep going. Oh, also side note, since I've already stopped, I hope it's not too soon to be wearing red hats, but that's a pineapple up there, not a mega. Yeah. All right. Did that work though? Half Truth? Is it better? Maybe anarchist tech support meant lowering resolution in stream program settings on the streamer's end. That's not what he meant when he said it. But yeah, just don't watch if it is too bothersome. There's literally nothing we can do about it unless you want to pay thousands of dollars to get them to, I don't know how much it would actually cost, but get internet direct to my humble abode here. I'm working on a 300-foot Ethernet cable, and actually it's worse than that. It's 250-foot cables that are connected to each other. So that slows the internet down. There's really nothing we can do about it. I've already turned the settings down to the lowest minimum. All right. Classical economics, therefore, essayed another turn. It said, wait, did I read this part? No, I did not. But as soon as the economists applied this determination of value by labor to the commodity labor, they fell from one contradiction into another, right? Because labor is itself a commodity, and you can't explain something against it, using itself, because that's just circular reasoning. So how is the value of labor determined? By the necessary labor embodied in it. But how much labor is embodied in the labor of a laborer of a day, a week, a month, a year? If labor is the measure of all values, we can express the value of labor only in labor, but we know absolutely nothing about the value of an hour's labor. If all that we know about it is that it is equal to 1 hour's labor, so thereby we have not advanced one hair's breadth nearer our goal. We are consistently turning about in a circle. Classical economics, therefore, essayed another turn. It said, the value of a commodity is equal to its cost of production. But what is the cost of production of labor? In order to answer this question, the economists are forced to strain logic just a little. Instead of investigating the cost of production of labor itself, which, unfortunately, cannot be ascertained, They now investigate the cost of production of the laborer. Okay, so yes, at the end of the day, we're going to have to figure out how much so the price of labor is going to approximate the average cost of production of the laborer in question. And this latter can be ascertained. It changes according to time and circumstances, but for a given condition of society in a given locality and in a given branch of production, it too is given, at least within quite narrow limits, right? So we can estimate how much the average reproduction of the laborer costs by calculating the average cost of rent, the average cost of food. You just take these basic necessaries, as they get called, and you add those up, and you're working in the realm of averages. So he'll get to this. It doesn't apply to everybody. In some people, it will not be enough to live. But the basic cost of the production of the laborer is the cost of the means of subsistence. The means of subsistence is the stuff you need to subsist off of, the stuff you need to eat and clothe yourself and stay housed with. And he says that is relative. He's saying that is relative to the condition of your society, to the given locality, the specific branch of production, right? So the means of subsistence for an engineer, right, is going to actually include their education in engineering. So that's included in this. We live today under the regime of capitalist production, under which a large and steadily growing class of the population can live only on the condition that it works for the owners of the means of production, which, he says here, mean the tools, machines, raw materials, and means of subsistence, right? So the people who own the factories, the people who own the land, the people who own or purchase, the minerals underneath the land, whatever it might be. And that these, actually, I lost my sentence here. We live, blah, 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 blah. Yeah, so we live today under the regime of capitalist production, under which a large and steadily growing class of the population can live only on the condition that it works for the owners of the tools, machines, raw materials, and means of subsistence in return for wages. On the basis of this mode of production, the laborer's cost of production consists of the sum of the means of subsistence, or their price in money, which on the average are requisite to enable him to work, to maintain in him this capacity for work, and to replace him at his departure, by reason of age, sickness, or death, with another laborer, that is to say, to propagate the working class in required numbers. And that's a really important point of clarification here. He uses the word capacity. A lot of people, if they do know about this distinction between the words labor and labor power, which is what this is all about right now, a lot of people will just say the difference between labor and labor power is that labor power is about labor capacity, your capacity to labor in a given week, in a given month. Right? You only have so much time and energy to be able to do anything in a week. That is your possible world. Your possible world is determined. Your possibilities of actualizing or realizing potential in the next week or month or in the next few years is all framed, structured, limited, and shown to be plausible or not. All of it within the horizon of your capacity to be able to do things with that time and energy that is finite, meaning limited, in a week. So I talk about time and energy all over the place on this channel, and got whole essays up about it and stuff like that. But for the time being, I just find it more useful to talk about capacity with the words time and energy, because we're not just talking about the capacity to labor. Because when we think of labor, we think of the exchange of your exertion of effort for wages, right? But the point about labor power is it's not just the exchange of actual exertion. There might be days when you're at work when you don't exert very much effort. So how does that make sense? No, it's the promise of availability. It's the promise of dependability. It's the reliability of being there as a resource to be used by the business in question. So they don't just pay you for what you actually do. They also pay you for being available, for being dependable, for showing up, for following through on promises. And you only have so many promises that you can make in a week. You only have so much effort you can exert into things in a week. You have to muster the mindset and energy reserves to make it through the week. And for doing that, you might say, you know what, I'm not able to help my friend move over the weekend because I am so exhausted and I just need to sleep all day. Because you have to recover your energy because your energy's been sucked up all week, right? So the point is you only have so much in a week. And that is your capacity for work. And that is what labor power is as a commodity. It's these promises of your future time and energy that are limited. All right. Let us assume that the money price of these means of subsistence averages 3 shillings a day. Our labor gets, therefore, a daily... And, I mean, can I just say dollars? Would it be the same as if I said dollars? You know? Let us assume that the money price of these means of subsistence averages $3 a day. Our laborer gets, therefore, a daily wage of $3 from his employer. For this, the capitalist lets him work, say, 12 hours. Okay. Now, thankfully to the battles that have been waged previous to us even being born, the 12-hour workday is less popular now than it was at the time. But I've still worked 12-hour days, and I'm sure many of you have as well. Our capitalist, moreover, calculates somewhat in the following fashion. Let us assume that our laborer, a machinist, has to make a part of a machine which he finishes in 1 day. The raw material, iron and brass in the necessary prepared form, costs $20. The consumption of coal by the steam engine, the wear and tear of this engine itself, of the turning lathe, and of the other tools with which our laborer works, represent for 1 day and 1 laborer a value of 1 shilling. The wages for 1 day are, according to our assumption, did I say shilling? It's $1. The wages of for 1 day are, according to our assumption, $3. This makes a total of $24 for our piece of a machine, right? So if you buy a machine and that machine is going to last for 10 years before it is made irrelevant by technological progress or before it deteriorates and falls apart, or if the upkeep of that machine is going to cost a certain amount of money every so often, that all has to be calculated in advance by the capitalist. So and then you basically can average it out and, into your calculations, factor in the cost of the reproduction of that machine, right? So when he's saying that the $1 per day, well, that's because, this machine, you use up a certain amount of that machine in a day. He's saying that you're using up $1 of it in a day. So that's how this calculation is being made. And this is just basic economics. And in any basic economics thing, you're going to learn about deterioration, or things fall apart and have to be upgraded or replaced. All right. But the capitalist calculates that on average, he will receive for it a price of $27 from his customers, or $3 over and above his outlay, right? Because if he's getting $27 for the product, then that's then there's a little profit margin there, right? He's making a little bit more over the values that have been combined. So the outlay is just the sum of the inputs that went into making that product, and the sum of that, what we just said above, was $24, which included the $3 for the worker for that day. Whence do these $3 pocketed by the capitalists come? Like, where did the extra money come from? According to the assertion of classical political economy, commodities are, in the long run, sold at their values. That is, they are sold at prices that correspond to the necessary quantities of labor contained in them. So this is like a general sort of doctrine in mainstream economics it is that due to supply and the fluctuations of supply and demand, things are always going to average out eventually to the cost of the production itself. So let's just say that you're buying hamburgers. Okay, you're on average paying the real cost of the production of that hamburger, because the capitalist doesn't get to just keep raising the prices of hamburgers, because there will be competitors who come in. And so when competition gets really fierce, everyone lowers their prices as much as they can. The people who aren't able to lower their prices low enough go out of business. And so everyone's just lowering it to like barely scraping by. Well, when you're just barely scraping by, you're going to lower the cost. You're going to lower the price to just enough to reproduce that commodity. So which is just the cost of the production of that commodity, which is exactly what he's saying right here. The average price, the average price of our part of a machine, $27, would therefore equal its value, as in equal the amount of labor embodied in it. But these $27, $21 were values already existing before the machinists began to work. $20 were contained in the raw material, $1 in the fuel consumed during the work, and in the machines and tools used up in the process and reduced in their efficiency to the value of this amount. There remains $6, which have been added to the value of the raw material. But according to the supposition of our economists themselves, these $6 can arise only from the labor added to the raw material by the laborer. His 12 hours labor has created, according to this, a new value of $6. Therefore, the value of his 12 hours labor would be equivalent to $6. So we have at last discovered what the value of labor is. Hold on there, cries our machinist. 6 shillings, but I have received only 3. My capitalist swears high and day that the value of my 12 hours labor is no more than 3 shillings, and if I were to demand 6, he'd laugh at me. What kind of a story is that? I like this hypothetical machinist. Eroso is right. That is something that people said before. You should be able to pause every once in a while and then just start again. So if you're fine not watching this immediately live, then you should be fine. If you watch it after the fact, you won't have these buffering issues either. Hi there, DDD. Did you hear the part of this video where I talked about you already early on? You'd have to go back. But glad to see you here. I was saying thank you for that donation last time, and I was finally able to track down the money, and I talked about that earlier, and I'm going to get that back to you. So sorry about that. Sorry about the fact that you accidentally paid $100 more than you meant to. Yeah, we'll get that sorted out still. Anyway, if before this we got with our value of labor into a vicious circle, we now surely have driven straight into an insoluble contradiction. We searched for the value of labor, and we found more than we can use. For the laborer, the value of the 12 hours labor is $3. For the capitalist, it is $6, of which he pays the working man $3 as wages and pockets the remaining $3 himself. According to this, labor has not one but 2 values, and moreover, 2 very different values. Okay. As soon as we reduce the values, now expressed in money in labor time, the contradiction becomes even more absurd. By the 12 hours labor, a new value of $6 is created. Therefore, the 6 hours, the new value created, equals $3. The amount, by the way, don't get too lost in this, y'all. This is where a lot of people's eyes can glaze over. They're hearing shillings, or the dollar amounts just don't really make sense. Someday I would like to just, take all of these examples and put them into modern calculations and all that. But for the time being, don't worry. We'll get to a summary point coming up here soon. So for 12 hours labor, the working man receives as an equivalent the product of 6 hours labor. We are thus forced to one of 2 conclusions. Either labor has 2 values, one of which is twice as large as the other, or 12 equals 6. In both cases, we get pure absurdities. Turn and twist as we may, we will not get out of this contradiction as long as we speak of the buying and selling of labor and the value of labor. And just so it happened to the political economists. The last offshoot of classical political economy, the Ricardian school, was largely wrecked on the insolubility of this contradiction. Classical political economy had run itself into a blind alley. The man who discovered the way out of this blind alley was none other than Karl Marx.
Amazing.
What the economists had considered as the cost of production of labor was really the cost of production not of labor, but the living laborer himself. And what this laborer sold to the capitalist was not his labor. Now he quotes Marx saying, "So soon as his labor really begins, it ceases to belong to him and therefore can no longer be sold by him. At the most, he could sell his future labor." This is such a... God, it's... Every time I read this, it's more relevant. He sells his future labor, as in assume the obligation of executing a certain piece of work in a certain time, right? So you're promising away availability to probably do more or less X amount of effort during the oncoming week. But in this way, he does not sell labor, which would first have to be performed, but not for a stipulated payment. He places his labor power at the disposal of the capitalist for a certain time, in case of time wages, or for the performance of a certain task, in case of piece wages. So if you get paid instead of hourly, you're getting paid commission, basically. Then yeah, that's piece wages. And so either way, this is factored in the same. He hires out or sells his labor power. With his labor power, has grown up with his person and is inseparable from it. Right? So your future and your ability to exert effort in a sustained, routine, dependable way is all something that you've developed the ability to do. The more skilled the labor, the more abilities you've developed. The more abilities you've developed to be able to meet tasks that are going to be increasingly more complex and require a higher degree of expertise. But either way, you're selling your labor power. If you sign a contract with some company and you're going to be on salary, there's in that contract the promise of your labor power. You're basically saying, me for the next year or 5 years or 10 years, whatever it is, me moving forward I will be putting the majority of my time, energy, and attention in a week, which are finite resources. I'll be putting those at the service of the person who will be paying the salary. But this labor power has grown up with his person and is inseparable from it. Its cost, the body's cost of production, therefore, coincides with his own cost of production. What the economists called the cost of production of labor is really the cost of production of the laborer, and therewith of his labor power. And thus, we can also go back from the cost of production of labor power to the value of labor power and determine the quantity of social labor that is required for the production of a labor power of a given quantity, as Marx has done in the chapter on the buying and selling of labor power in Capital Volume 1. Definitely worth checking out. Now, what takes place after the worker has sold his labor power, as in after he has placed his labor power at the disposal of the capitalist for stipulated wages, whether time wages or piece wages? The capitalist takes the laborer into his workshop or factory, where all the articles required for the work can be found: raw materials, auxiliary materials, coal, dyestuffs, etc., tools and machines. Here the worker begins to work. His daily wages are as above $3, and it makes no difference whether he earns them as day wages or as piece wages. We again assume that in 12 hours, the worker adds by his labor a new value of 6 shillings or $6 to the value of the raw materials consumed, which new value the capitalist realizes by the sale of the finished piece of work. Out of this new value, he pays the worker his $3, and the remaining $3 he keeps for himself. If now the laborer creates in 12 hours a value of $6, in 6 hours he creates a value of $3. Consequently, after working 6 hours for the capitalist, the laborer has returned to him the equivalent of the $3 received as wages. After 6 hours work, both are quits, neither one owing a penny to the other. "Hold on there," now cries out the capitalist. "I have hired the laborer for a whole day, for 12 hours, but 6 hours are only half a day. So work along lively there until the other 6 hours are at an end. Only then will we be even." And in fact, the laborer has to submit to the conditions of the contract upon which he entered of his own free will, in scare quotes, and according to which he bound himself to work 12 whole hours for a product of labor which costs only 6 hours labor. So why was his own free will in scare quotes? Because you, in a highly mechanized society, can't really compete with the productivity of machines. So the people who own the machines, then you have no real other options to be able to supply yourself with the means of subsistence necessary for living a life with any kind of dignity beyond the selling of your future to someone in exchange for the wages necessary to buy those means of subsistence, right? So now, obviously, you could just live in a tent. You don't need to pay rent if you live in a tent. You could just, go out in the forest and, pick nuts and trap beavers and shit like that. You can do that. Go start a little commune with 3 friends, whatever. But the issue is that a life with dignity is a relative thing. So to be able to be a person who operates in this highly mechanized society with increasingly refined modes of production, you have to be able to have a cell phone, probably a smartphone. How are you going to navigate this world without a smartphone when more and more things are going paperless? You got to have a driver's license. You got to have a car. There's all these, you got to have insurance. Got to have registration. All those things take a lot of time and effort and preparation. And so if you're starting from a basis of already being homeless, then you have a lot of fucking work cut out for you. Especially if you don't have any of those essential documents like your social security card, your birth certificate, your driver's license. How do you open a bank? You can't even get half those things without a bank account, but you can't even open a bank account without those things. So there's a lot of ways that people get locked out of this thing. And so if you got raised within it and you had parents who kind of helped you acclimate and adjust to this to the social situation, then you should be able to navigate it. But but point being, it's expensive. It takes time and effort and money, and that a lot of the things that we kind of just presume, if we were taught how to do those things, they're not so easy. And I know that firsthand, but also because I've helped other people through those things, and it's a huge hassle. So point being, a life of dignity and the means of subsistence for being able to live a basically decent life, that's relative. And so how do you acquire those means of subsistence in a society where they cost more than anything that you are able to produce on your own by mere exertion of effort onto the natural world? Well, it's going to be trading away your future to someone who is purchasing your labor power in exchange for wages which you will use for your means of subsistence. I hope that all makes sense. I'm trying to say it all multiple ways, and I will continue to do so throughout the rest of this reading. Similarly, with piece wages, let us suppose that in 12 hours our worker makes 12 commodities. Each of these costs a shilling in raw materials. All right, I'm sorry. I'll keep going with the dollar thing. Each of these costs $1 in raw materials and wear and tear, and is sold for $2.5. On our former assumption, the capitalist gives the laborer 25 cents for each piece, which makes a total of $3 for 12 pieces. To earn this, the worker requires 12 hours. The capitalist receives $30 for the 12 pieces. Deducting $24 for raw materials and wear and tear, there remains $6, of which he pays $3 in wages and pockets the remaining $3. Just as before, here also the worker labors 6 hours for himself, as in to replace his wages, half an hour in each of the 12 hours, and 6 hours for the capitalist. Now, the only thing I would add that I don't think he says here is that obviously, like, if you're getting paid piece rate, part of that incentive structure is that you will be self-motivated to be more productive than you would have been if you were just being paid hourly. And commission usually does work that way, or piece rate. So the point is baked into this incentive structure, even though you can earn more in a day by exerting more effort and producing more of the goods or the service, nevertheless, you're going to be left over at the end of that, still undercompensated, right? So even though you're making more, you're still undercompensated. The rock upon which the best economists were stranded, as long as they started out from the value of labor, vanishes as soon as we make our starting point the value of labor power. Labor power is, in our present-day capitalist society, a commodity, like every other commodity, but yet a very peculiar commodity. It has, namely, the peculiarity, the strangeness of being a value-creating force, the source of value, and moreover, when properly treated, the source of more value than it possesses itself. In the present state of production, human labor power not only produces in a day a greater value than it itself possesses and costs, but with each new scientific discovery, with each new technical invention, there also rises the surplus of its daily production over its daily cost. Meaning that as machines replace certain tasks, workers are able to produce more in shorter periods of time as they operate those machines. Okay, so the extra goes from being $3 extra value added to that, to the person, to the capitalist, to being more and more, right? While as a consequence, there diminishes that part of the working day in which the laborer produces the equivalent of his day's wages. So it only takes, 2 hours out of the day to pay your wages, or to create the value commensurate with the wages that you've been paid to work that day. You did that in the first 2 hours. Now you're there for the rest of the day. Well, what are you doing there for the rest of the day? You're just making value for the capitalist. That's the point. And on the other hand, lengthens that part of the working day in which you must present labor gratis to the capitalist, right? So if you create the value of your own production in 2 hours, but then you work the rest of the day, oh, that's a fantastic situation for the capitalist. And this is the economic constitution of our entire modern society. The working class alone produces all values. For value is only another expression. By the way, now that assumption, that assumption right there is one that I will problematize later. I don't know if I'll do it in this stream, but I think that there are important aspects of this process that are not reducible to the labor power being put into the goods and services. So, but we can come back to that. For value is only another expression for labor. That expression, namely, by which is designated in our capitalist society of today, the amount of socially necessary labor embodied in a particular commodity. But these values produced by the workers do not belong to the workers. They belong to the owners of the raw materials, machines, tools, and money, which enable them to buy the labor power of the working class. Hence, the working class gets back only a part of the entire mass of products produced by it, and, as we have just seen, the other portion, which the capitalist class retains, and which it has to share, at most, only with the landlord class, is increasing with every new discovery and invention, while the share which falls to the working class per capita rises but little and very slowly, or not at all, and under certain conditions it may even fall, right? So So during periods of new discovery and invention, during economic booms, the wages can go up a little bit for the working class, and that's a very nice time. But then just the necessary booms and busts that come with the competition that is hardwired into capitalism will necessarily bring those wages back down to the mere reproduction of the worker. But these discoveries and inventions which supplant one another with ever-increasing speed, the productiveness of human labor which increases from day to day to unheard of proportions, at least gives rise to a conflict in which present capitalistic economy must go to ruin. On the one hand, immeasurable wealth and superfluity of products with which the buyers cannot cope. On the other hand, the great mass of society proletarianized, which is to say, turned into the industrial army, who doesn't have like their own property. Like even serfs have like a sort of like their own place. Proletarians are almost homeless in the city. On the other hand, the great mass of society proletarianized, transformed into wage laborers, and thereby disabled from appropriating to themselves that superfluity of products. The split. What the fuck does superfluity mean? I knew, but I forgot. Let's look it up.
Superfluidity.
The property of flowing without friction or viscosity, as in liquid helium below about 2.18 kelvins. The general movement, the movability of something. The splitting up of society into a small class, immoderately rich, and a large class of wage laborers devoid of all property, brings it about that this society smothers in its own superfluidity, while the great majority of its members are scarcely, or not at all, protected from extreme want. Okay, we're almost at the end of Engels' introduction. This condition becomes every day more absurd and more unnecessary. It must be gotten rid of. It can be gotten rid of. A new social order is possible in which the class differences of today will have disappeared, and in which perhaps after a short transition period which, though somewhat deficient in other respects, will in any case be very useful morally, there will be the means of life, of the enjoyment of life, and of the development and activity of all bodily and mental faculties through the systematic use and further development of the enormous productive powers of society, which exists with us even now, with equal obligation upon all to work. So he's saying we could live in a society where everybody is able to develop their talents, to be able to pursue the things that matter to them, and insofar as there is necessary labor that has to be put out there into society to enhance the overall level of society, as long as there are goods and services that we all want and or potentially need to be able to partake in, we will all in some way, shape, or form be productive in that society. There will not be a class of people who they only work because they want to make sure that they still have access to daddy's trust fund, or they only work in the sense of like attending board meetings or committee meetings or whatever. No, if there's basic work that has to be done, we should all share that basic work, and it should be limited so much as to free us up to be able to do a lot of other things. And that the workers are growing ever more determined to achieve this new social order will be proven on both sides of the ocean on this dawning May Day and on Sunday, May 3rd. Engels is referring to the May Day celebrations of 1891. And there we go. Frederick Engels, London, April 30th, 1891. History did not go exactly as he planned, but the basic dream of a society wherein this radical divide between a handful of people who get to live off of the futures of others and those who trade away their futures for their own base mere reproduction, that kind of a situation can be changed. That's potentially changed. So there we go. That's the introduction. And then there's footnotes that I will not read. And then we will move on to Marx's preliminary. That took an hour. We've been streaming for an hour. I did not expect that it would, honestly, be this long. How's everybody doing? I plan on reading this whole thing, but who knows? I might start coughing and lose my voice before we get there. So we will see. Just making sure I don't have any. Oh, wow. Somebody Venmo'd me. It has been a long time since anybody's Venmo'd me. Hey, thanks so much for taking the time and educating us other plebes, says Olga. Well, Olga, thank you so much for the $20. That was great. Great. Wow. I didn't expect that. That's cool. Okay. Well, how's it going, chat? I'm going to peek in on you all really quick. I want to touch on chat before we jump into the next section, because as we were talking about earlier, there will be timestamps later. Hopefully somebody will make the nice section headers and do all of that work. If you don't, maybe I'll do it, but it'll probably be like 6 months before I get around to it. Anyway, Half Truth and Eroso looks like they're commenting on the stuff that I was talking about, that I was reading. Maybe reduction of cost for public research. Yeah, totally. Yeah, the subsidies. Apple components. Yeah. There's a lot of public research that gets privatized. Absolutely. Like when Apple components is a oh rip. I'll start rewatching the beginning to eliminate the skips. Oh, good. Half Truth started watching from the beginning, and that eliminated the skips. Good to hear. Also, there should be a way of buffering it a little to prevent the skips, but I don't know how to set that up. Yeah, I'm sorry. This is the price you pay for wanting to watch this. This is the price that we all pay for me living a lifestyle like I am currently living, where I have reduced the cost of my means of subsistence so radically by living in this tiny house. Yes. And why did I do that? To free up time, energy in the week. Because the basic principles that we're talking about here. Now, I'm going to step aside for a brief moment to do a human thing. And as I do that, I'm going to start playing the Robot Red version of this preliminary by Karl Marx. Just look, if you don't like the Robot Reader, I always end up saying this, but if you don't like the Robot Reader, don't worry, I'll be right back. But also, maybe you'll get used to it over time. So open up your mind, realize you don't need to get it all in the first go. You can always come back to it later. If it's worth reading, it's worth returning to. A lot of people joining are only joining for 15 to 20 minutes right now. And so for you, you're able to kind of, oh, cool, I'm learning something maybe. But what you're really learning beyond what is said in the moment that you're here is whether or not or when to come back to this video, because I think a lot of people will over time keep hearing wage, labor, and capital get referenced, and because I've done the stream and you saw part of it, eventually you'll be like, oh, I'm gonna go back to that, and you'll get so much more out of it every time you do. So much more out of it every time you do. Here we go.
Karl Marx, Wage, Labor, and Capital. Preliminary.
Uh-oh, it's just loading forever. That's how good my internet is right now, apparently. Yeah, I dropped a lot of frames on this stream.
From various quarters we have been reproached for neglecting to portray the economic conditions which form the material basis of the present struggles between classes and nations. With set purpose we have hitherto touched upon these conditions only when they forced themselves upon the surface of the political conflicts. It was necessary, beyond everything else, to follow the development of the class struggle in the history of our own day, and to prove empirically, by the actual and daily newly created historical material, that with the subjugation of the working class, accomplished in the days of February and March, 1848, the opponents of that class, the bourgeois republicans in France, and the bourgeois and peasant classes who were fighting feudal absolutism throughout the whole continent of Europe, were simultaneously conquered. That the victory of the moderate republic in France sounded at the same time the fall of the nations which had responded to the February Revolution with heroic wars of independence. And finally that, by the victory over the revolutionary workingmen, Europe fell back into its old double slavery, into the English-Russian slavery. The June conflict in Paris, the fall of Vienna, the tragicomedy in Berlin in November 1848, the desperate efforts of Poland, Italy, and Hungary, the starvation of Ireland into submission. These were the chief events in which the European class struggle between the bourgeoisie and the working class was summed up, and from which we proved that every revolutionary uprising, however remote from the class struggle its object might appear, must of necessity fail until the revolutionary working class shall have conquered. That every social reform must remain a utopia until the proletarian revolution and the feudalistic counter-revolution have been pitted against each other in a worldwide war.
So far, all Marx is doing is he's opening this by being like the working class in 48 had just suffered a serious defeat at the hand of the bourgeois republic in France, and he is saying that until we understand this monster, this political and economic monster that we are in the midst of, we can't understand the stakes of the situation and truly grapple with it. And that's why he's saying that until people get it and the working class gets its shit together, until that, every social reform will remain a utopia. Meaning that any kind of praxis you try to do without understanding the reality of the situation that you're in is probably a waste of time because it's working within the frame of the problem without getting outside of it, without fundamentally changing it. Then he says, do we already...
in our presentation, as in reality, Belgium and Switzerland were tragicomic caricaturist genre pictures in the great historic tableau, the one the model state of the bourgeois monarchy, the other the model state of the bourgeois republic. Both of them states that flatter themselves to be just as free from the class struggle as from the European Revolution. But now, after our readers have seen the class struggle of the year 1848 develop into colossal political proportions, it is time to examine more closely the economic conditions themselves upon which is founded the existence of the capitalist class and its class rule, as well as the slavery of the workers. We shall present the subject in three great divisions: the relation of wage labor to capital, the slavery of the worker, the rule of the capitalist, the inevitable ruin of the middle classes, petty bourgeois, and the so-called commons, peasants, under the present system, the commercial subjugation and exploitation of the bourgeois classes of the various European nations by the despot of the world market, England. We shall seek to portray this as simply and popularly as possible, and shall not presuppose a knowledge of even the most elementary notions of political economy. We wish to be understood by the workers. And, moreover, there prevails in Germany the most remarkable ignorance and confusion of ideas in regard to the simplest economic relations, from the patented defenders of existing conditions, down to the socialist wonder workers and the unrecognized political geniuses, in which divided Germany is even richer than in duodecimo princelings. We therefore proceed to the consideration of the first problem.
The first problem, what are wages?
What are wages? Wage labor.
So we're going to read what are wages, and we're going to begin that right now. So all that he did in the last section was introduce it by saying the working class has suffered defeats. It will continue to do so until it figures out or until it understands the problem. And so this newspaper article or series of newspaper articles is for the purpose of educating the workers who need to understand the situation that they're in so that they can strategically respond to it. So we begin with the question, what are wages? And I feel like this is a very short part of the text, and it will be probably a form of review for what you've already heard. So let's just dive right in. What are wages? How are they determined? If several workmen were to ask, how much wages do you get? One would reply, I get 2 shillings a day, and so on. According to the different branches of industry in which they are employed, they would mention different sums of money, and they would receive from their respective employers for the completion of a certain task, for example, for weaving a yard of linen or for setting a page of type. Despite the variety of their statements, they would all agree upon one point, that wages are the amount of money which the capitalist pays for a certain period of work or for a certain amount of work. Consequently, it appears that the capitalist buys their labor with money, and that for money they sell him their labor. But this is merely an illusion. What they actually sell to the capitalist for money is their labor power. This labor power the capitalist buys for a day, a week, a month, etc. And after he has bought it, he uses it up by letting the worker labor during the stipulated time. With the same amount of money with which the capitalist has bought their labor power, for example, for $2 or $20 or $150, he could have bought a certain amount of sugar or of any other commodity. The 2 shillings with which he bought 20 pounds of sugar is the price of the 20 pounds of sugar. The 2 shillings with which he bought 12 hours use of labor power is the price of 12 hours labor. Labor power then is a commodity no more, no less so than sugar. This is right here. This is a big deal. That matters. We'll see how much it matters as we move forward. But that the fact that labor power is made a commodity by capital is the chief issue and our primary concern. So the first is measured by the clock. So labor power is measured by the clock, the other by scales. And we shouldn't just say clock because we're talking about the future. We're talking about the calendar. We're talking about the weekly, monthly, annual calendar. The clock is just one of the 2 main devices. It's the clock and the calendar. There, being the worker, their commodity, labor power, the worker's exchange for the commodity of the capitalist for money, and moreover, this exchange takes place at a certain ratio. So much money for so long a use of labor power. For 12 hours weaving, 2 shillings. And these 2 shillings, do they not represent all the other commodities which I can buy for 2 shillings? Yeah, so $20 is $20. $20 is it's a meal. It could be multiple meals. If you prepare it yourself, it could be even more meals. It's also a percentage of the cost that you'll be paying for rent, whatever. Therefore, actually, the worker has exchanged his commodity labor power for commodities of all kinds, and moreover, at a certain ratio. By giving him 2 shillings, the capitalist has given him so much meat, so much clothing, so much wood, light, etc., in exchange for his day's work. The 2 shillings, therefore, express the relation in which labor power is exchanged for other commodities, the exchange value of labor power. The exchange value of the commodity, as estimated in money, is called its price. Wages, therefore, are only a special name for the price of labor power, and are usually called the price of labor. It is the special name for the price of this peculiar commodity, which has no other repository than human flesh and blood. Let us take any worker, for example, a weaver. The capitalist supplies him with the loom and yarn. The weaver applies himself to the work, and the yarn is turned into cloth. The capitalist takes possession of the cloth and sells it for 20 shillings, for example. Now, are the wages of the weaver a share of the cloth, of the 20 shillings, of the product of the work? By no means. Because you're paid. Think about it. When you're paid to do something, specifically the way he's talking about it, like the money has been advanced to you, or in the budget, the money has been set aside to pay workers that are being brought on board. So the money is already there. You're getting an advance. Long before the cloth is sold, perhaps long before it is fully woven, the weaver has received his wages. The capitalist, then, does not pay his wages out of the money which he will obtain from the cloth, but out of the money already on hand. Just as little as loom and yarn are the product of the weaver to whom they are supplied by the employer, just so little are the commodities by which he receives in exchange for his commodity, labor power, his product. It is possible that the employer found no purchasers at all for the cloth. It is possible that he did not even get the amount of the wages by its sale, right? So the capitalist can lose in this situation. A capitalist would justify taking the additional value created by the worker beyond their mere reproduction, taking that and pocketing it. They justify that because, one, we have to be continually investing surplus value made here into the research and development and upgrading and replacement or maintenance of the means of production. And also so that we are able to get through those rough times when the competition gets bad, or when there's poor, if you're a farmer, maybe there was a bad harvest year, bad crop year, whatever it is. You need that extra money for when the times get rough. But that's what they would say, but we'll get back to that later. So it's possible that whatever is made by that employee doesn't actually go to market. Let's just say that everybody in a factory is making something that becomes obsolete. Okay, and then everyone just got paid to make something that no longer has the value that it was originally estimated to have. There's going to be a situation here where the capitalist is taking a loss. It is possible that the capitalist sells it very profitably in proportion to the weaver's wages, but also that does not concern the weaver. With a part of his existing wealth, of his capital, the capitalist buys the labor power of the weaver in exactly the same manner as, with another part of his wealth, he has bought the raw material, the yarn, and the instrument of labor, the loom. And he has made these purchases, and among them belongs the labor power necessary to the production of the cloth he produces only with raw materials and instruments of labor belonging to him. For our good weaver, too, is one of the instruments of labor, and being in this respect on a par with the loom, he has no more share in the product, the cloth, or in the price of the product than the loom itself. So the way that he just said that right there is getting at the difference between labor and labor power. In classical political economy, folks like Ricardo and Adam Smith talk about labor as though labor is this, it's like a commodity, like a pen. Like I could just give it to you, or I could exchange it to you. Here, I'm going to give you one of my labors and you're going to give me some monies. No, the point is that in that situation, the laborer and their labor power is, it's like one of the machines on the factory floor, right? Like you being there, you're reduced to a machine, basically. You're a machine that is on call for a period of time. Wages, therefore, are not a share of the worker in the commodities produced by himself. Wages that are part of already existing commodities with which the capitalist buys a certain amount of productive labor power. They are that part of already existing commodities with which the capitalist buys a certain amount of productive labor power. Consequently, labor power is a commodity which its possessor, the wage worker, sells to the capitalist. Why does he sell it? It is in order to live. This gets back to the whole question of how consensual or of your free will is selling yourself into labor. How consensual really is it when you need to do it just to survive? But the putting of labor power into action, as in the work, is the active expression of the laborer's own life. And this life activity he sells to another person in order to secure the necessary means of life. His life activity, therefore, is but a means of securing his own existence, right? So if you were just fending for yourself in the woods, you're going to spend a lot of time just, securing the means for your own existence, which means, trapping and fishing and setting up your shelter and all of that kind of stuff. He works that he may keep alive. He does not count the labor itself as a part of his life. It is rather a sacrifice of his life. It is a commodity that he has auctioned off to another. The product of his activity, therefore, is not the aim of his activity. What he produces for himself is not the silk that he weaves, nor not the gold that he draws up the mining shaft, not the palace that he builds. What he produces for himself is wages. And the silk, the gold, and the palace are resolved for him into a certain quantity of necessaries of life, perhaps into a cotton jacket, into copper coins, and into a basement dwelling. So you're paying your rent, you're paying your clothing, paying your utilities, paying insurance and registration and cars and payments and things and blah, 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 blah. And the laborer who for 12 hours long weaves, spins, bores, turns, builds, shovels, breaks stone, carries hods, and so on, is this 12 hours weaving, spinning, boring, turning, building, shoveling, stone breaking regarded by him as a manifestation of life, as life? No, quite the contrary. Life for him begins where this activity ceases, right? You're doing this all for someone else. I remember I was doing a construction job, and it was like a $5 million house that I was helping build. There was like a bowling alley in there and all of this kind of stuff. And it was like, wow, cool. I'm really helping this person have their dream house. And, I'm getting paid enough to help me pay my rent at the end of the month. But, yeah, that's not my bowling alley, and I'll never get to use that bowling alley. And that's just the way of it. That's you're making the world turn round for other people, and a lot of the times the things that you're making aren't even things that you get to enjoy yourself, unless you work at Subway and you get to eat the sandwiches sometimes or something, I guess. Life for him begins where this activity ceases, at the table, at the tavern, in bed. The 12 hours, does he mean sleeping or something else? The 12 hours work, on the other hand, has no meaning for him as weaving, spinning, boring, and so on, but only as earnings, which enable him to sit down at a table, to take his seat in the tavern, and to lie down in a bed. So it's all ulterior motives. You're there on the factory floor for why? For these other things that matter more to you in life. So the estranged labor assisted reading, which is up on my channel, you go check that out. He goes way more into depth on what he's talking about here on that alienation line. If the silkworm's object and by the way, right here, this is my favorite quote from the whole reading. So here we go. If the silkworm's object in spinning were to prolong its existence as caterpillar, it would be a perfect example of a wage worker. What does that mean? How does that make sense? Well, a caterpillar, you have a silkworm caterpillar. It spins, its cocoon. Why does it do that? That's just a necessary part of its own reproduction. And after a certain point, it's going to be able to, because of that work that it's invested into its basic necessary reproduction, it's going to be able to transform into something else. It's going to be able to transform into a butterfly. And you and I, every human has certain fundamental needs that if those needs are not met, if we do not drink water, if we do not eat food, if we do not sleep, if we do not have safety and security, if we're not able to dress ourselves and present ourselves to others in a way that allows us to go on living like a basic dignified life, then we're going to become social pariahs and outcasts. So there's these basic necessaries. It's kind of like the base of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Those things are, he's in this analogy, it's like the silkworm having to do certain things before it can become a butterfly. Okay, but how much time does it really take in a week to reproduce yourself? Okay, and there's been societies before where it only took 20 hours in a week and the rest of the time was spent storytelling and dancing, doing psychedelics, right? So why does it take 50 hours in a week for some people just to be able to scrape by? The point is that if all of your life is spent making silk for other butterflies, then you're never going to get your own cocoon from which to grow into a butterfly. God, does this analogy work? Are you all following along? I hope so. Let's move it along. Labor power is not always a commodity, merchandise. Labor was not always wage labor, as in free labor. The slave did not sell... Fuck, why am I getting so many messages right now? Okay, hold on. I'm just going to put this on airplane mode. Labor power was not always a commodity, merchandise. Labor was not always wage labor, as in free labor. The slave did not sell his labor power to the slave owner any more than the ox sells his labor to the farmer. The slave, together with his labor power, was sold to his owner once for all. He is a commodity that can pass from the hand of one owner to that of another. He himself is a commodity, but his labor power is not his commodity. The serf sells only a portion of his labor power. It is not he who receives wages from the owner of the land. It is rather the owner of the land who receives a tribute from him. The serf belongs to the soil, and to the lord of the soil he brings its fruit. The free laborer, on the other hand, sells his very self, and that by fractions. He auctions off 8, 10, 12, 15 hours of his life, one day like the next, to the highest bidder, to the owner of raw materials, tools, and the means of life, as in to the in other words, to the capitalist. The laborer belongs neither to an owner nor to the soil, but 8, 10, 12, 15 hours of his daily life belong to whomsoever buys them. The worker leaves the capitalist to whom he has sold himself as often as he chooses, and the capitalist discharges him as often as he sees fit, as soon as he no longer gets any use or not the required use out of him. But the worker whose only source of income is the sale of his labor power cannot leave the whole class of buyers, meaning the capitalist class, unless he gives up his own existence. He does not belong to this or that capitalist, but to the capitalist class, and it is for him to find his man, in other words, to find a buyer in this capitalist class. Right? And so nowadays, like, the whole thing with college is like learning how to develop a professional portfolio that would make you a competitor, a better competitor in the labor market. So, what you're learning in those classes is often kind of geared towards padding out that portfolio in a way that will make you saleable, that will make them want to purchase your labor power. Before entering more closely upon the relation of capital to wage labor, we shall present briefly the most general conditions which come into consideration in the determination of wages. Wages, as we have seen, are the price of a certain commodity, labor power. Wages, therefore, are determined by the same laws that determine the price of every other commodity. The question, then, is, how is the price of a commodity determined? Well, we're going to find out now. Euroso says 18 minutes behind like a boss. Yeah, so the people who are going back and then playing forward are having a way better time. If the buffering drives you crazy, that's exactly what you want to do. It's also a way to go back to stuff that you missed and then fast forward your way through, if that's something that you care about. New section. By what is the price of a commodity determined? By the competition between buyers and sellers, by the relation of the demand to the supply, of the call to the offer. The competition by which the price of a commodity is determined is threefold. The same commodity is offered for sale by various sellers. Whoever sells commodities of the same quality most cheaply is sure to drive the other sellers from the field and to secure the greatest market for himself. The sellers therefore fight amongst themselves for the sales, for the market. Each one of them wishes to sell, and to sell as much as possible, and if possible, to sell alone, to the exclusion of all other sellers. Each one sells cheaper than the other. Thus there takes place a competition among the sellers which forces down the price of the commodities offered by them. But there is also a competition among the buyers. This upon its side causes the price of the proffered commodities to rise. Finally, there is a competition between the buyers and the sellers. These wish to purchase as cheaply as possible, those to sell as dearly as possible. The result of this competition between buyers and sellers will depend upon the relations between the two above mentioned camps of competitors. In other words, upon whether the competition in the army of sellers is stronger. Industry leads two great armies into the field against each other, and each of these again is engaged in a battle among its own troops in its own market. The army among whose troops there is less fighting carries off the victory over the opposing host. He's just describing, competition in the market and how it works with supply and demand. Basically, there's a certain amount of demand, and obviously, capitalists want to be able to supply that demand, and preferably at a higher price than what they're paying. But of course, there's going to be competitors always looking for a way to undercut whatever it is that you're doing, so that they can get a share of those customers being the source of that demand. Let us suppose that there are 100 bales of cotton in the market and at the same time purchasers for 1,000 bales of cotton. In this case, the demand is 10 times greater than the supply. Competition among the buyers, then, will be very strong. Each of them tries to get hold of one bale, if possible, of the whole 100 bales, right? So if there's only, let's just say that, there's a bunch of people that need bales. They need it, let's just say that there's enough people who need bales that there's the demand is for 1,000 bales, but there's only 100 available. Well, then you're one of those capitalists who needs bales. You're going to try to get all 100 of those bales because you fucking need those. That's an input for whatever it is that you are producing. This example is no arbitrary supposition, says Marx. In the history of commerce, we have experienced periods of scarcity of cotton when some capitalists united together and sought to buy up not 100 bales, but the whole cotton supply of the world. In the given case, then, one buyer seeks to drive the others from the field by offering a relatively higher price for the bales of cotton. The cotton sellers, who perceive the troops of the enemy in the most violent contention among themselves, and who therefore are fully assured of the sale of their whole 100 bales, will beware of pulling one another's hair in order to force down the price of cotton at the very moment in which their opponents race with one another to screw it up high. So all of a sudden, peace reigns in the army of sellers because they decide to work together. They stand opposed to the buyers like one man, fold their arms in philosophic contentment, and their claims would find no limit did not the offers of even the most importunate of buyers have. I'll reread that sentence, but here.
Now that's just not the way to go here, Karen.
Hey, thank you for the follow on Twitch there, Decian Tito.
Importunate,
persistent, especially to the point of annoyance or intrusion. Okay. So it's kind of like saying stubborn. They stand opposed to the buyers like one man, fold their arms in philosophic contentment, and their claims would find no limit did not the offers of even the most importunate of buyers have a very definite limit. If then the supply of a commodity is less than the demand for it, competition among the sellers is very slight, or there may be none at all among them. In the same proportion in which this competition decreases, the competition among the buyers increases. Result? A more or less considerable rise in the prices of commodities. Hey, thank you. Yeah, the video looks good, sounds good. You hope I have an awesome stream. Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, people are watching from YouTube, people are watching from Twitch, and people are watching from my personal site because I'm using Restream. And that makes it so that it looks like not as many people are watching, but I think there's like a total of like 15 on average. And out of those 15 on average, some people are tuning in for 10 minutes to a half hour. So I hope that it adds something of value to your day, but more importantly, that you will see this video on my channel in the future as a sort of resource that you can always come back to if you ever want to tackle this text, and you could use another person's kind of unpacking it to make it more accessible. Anyway, if then the supply of the commodity is less than the demand for it, competition among the sellers is very slight, or there may be none at all among them. In the same proportion in which this competition decreases, the competition among the buyers increases. Result: a more or less considerable rise in the prices of commodities. It is well known that the opposite case, with the opposite result, happens more frequently. Great excess of supply over demand, desperate competition among the sellers, and a lack of buyers. Forced sales of commodities at ridiculously low prices. But what is a rise and what a fall of prices? What is a high and what a low price? A grain of sand is high when examined through a microscope, and a tower is low when compared with a mountain. And if the price is determined by the relation of supply and demand, by what is the relation of supply and demand determined? It's all relative. Okay, well, then relative to what? Let us turn to the first worthy citizen we meet. He will not hesitate one moment, but like Alexander the Great, will cut this metaphysical knot with his multiplication table. This is just Marx being kind of sarcastic. He will say to us, if the production of the commodities which I sell has cost me 100 pounds, and out of the sale of these goods I make 110 pounds within the year, you understand, that's an honest, sound, reasonable profit. But if in the exchange I receive 120 or 130 pounds, that's a higher profit. And if I should get as much as 200 pounds, that would be an extraordinary and enormous profit. Okay? What is it, then, that serves this citizen as the standard of his profit? The cost of the production of his commodities is the standard of his profit. Meaning the standard against which you measure your profit would be the cost of the production. Right. So if he's putting 100 pounds into the products being sold that year and he makes 110, so he's only made that those 10 pounds over and above what he spent. So the measure of what that profit margin is set against how much is spent in the outlay of the inputs. You follow? If he receives in exchange for his goods a quantity of other goods whose production has cost more, he has gained. And he reckons the falling or rising of the profit according to the degree at which the exchange value of his goods stands, whether above or below his zero, the cost of production. Okay. We have seen how the changing relation of supply and demand causes now a rise, now a fall of prices, now high, now low prices. If the price of a commodity rises considerably owing to a failing supply or a disproportionately growing demand, then the price of some other commodity must have fallen in proportion. For of course, the price of a commodity only expresses in money the proportion in which other commodities will be given in exchange for it, right? The price doesn't mean anything outside of the exchange for other commodities. They're all compared against one another, and money is used as a universal, the universal commodity for those exchanges, right? That's the measure for the universal exchange. If, for example, the price of a yard of silk rises from 2 to 3 shillings, the price of silver has fallen in relation to the silk, and in the same way, the prices of all other commodities whose prices have remained stationary have fallen in relation to the price of silk. A large quantity of them must be given in exchange in order to obtain the same amount of silk. Now, what will be the consequence of a rise in the price of a particular commodity? A mass of capital will be thrown into the prosperous branch of industry, and this immigration of capital into the provinces of the favored industry will continue until it yields no more than the customary profits, or rather until the price of its products, owing to overproduction, sinks below the cost of production. And this right here is what we talk about, I think, when we talk about a bubble in a market. There's a period of time when people can just continuously invest and almost guaranteed see a great return on their investment. But then eventually that market will reach an equilibrium and the profit margins will start to close down, right? And narrow. Conversely, if the price of a commodity falls below its cost of production, then capital will be withdrawn from the production of this commodity. Except in the case of a branch of industry which has become obsolete and is therefore doomed to disappear, the production of such a commodity, that is, its supply, will, owing to this flight of capital, continue to decrease until it corresponds to the demand, and the price of the commodity rises again to the level of its cost of production, or rather until the supply has fallen below the demand and its price has risen above its cost of production. For the current price of a commodity is always either above or below its cost of production. So in order to outcompete everybody else in the market, if the capitalist has enough disposable capital to invest in undercutting the competitors, then that capitalist might choose to take a loss for a while, which is to say, selling for lower than the cost of production as a way to drive out everyone else from the market. Because let's just say that you're a small business and you're already selling your commodities where the profit margin is pretty small, and so these are almost being sold at the cost of their production. But then Walmart moves in and starts selling exactly what you're selling, but way cheaper. That Walmart could be taking a loss, and this would happen all the time. This has happened all the time. It's a big part of Walmart's business model is to move into a town and lower prices for 10 years, take a loss on various commodities that will necessarily drive out of business the competitors in the area. And then after those people are gone, they can start slowly raising those prices again to where they make back what they were losing. But because they have Walmarts and all these other areas that have already done that, they've got the additional profits coming from those ones to be able to fund the losses they're taking in this local region. Okay. We see how capital continually emigrates out of the province of one industry and immigrates into that of another, right? So there's like the tech boom, and you have all these people investing into these tech companies where they are actually worth more on the market in exchange value than anything that they've actually really produced yet, because this is a lot of speculation and investors hedging their bets that there will be a monopoly to be gained later if, for instance, it becomes something like Amazon or PayPal, where now that's a platform that everybody else uses, right? That's what they're investing in hopes of gaining, is a monopoly like that. We could show for another point of view how not only the supply but also the demand is determined by the cost of production, but this would lead us too far away from our subject. We have just seen how the fluctuation of supply and demand always bring the price of a commodity back to its cost of production. The actual price of a commodity, indeed, stands always above or below the cost of production, but the rise and fall reciprocally balance each other, so, which is reciprocally means working in both ways. So it balances each other so that within a certain period of time, if the ebbs and flows of the industry are reckoned up together, the commodities will be exchanged for one another in accordance with their cost of production. Their price is thus determined by their cost of production. The determination of price by the cost of production is not to be understood in the sense of the bourgeois economists. The economists say that the average price of commodities equals the cost of production. That is the law. The anarchic movement, in which the rise is compensated for by a fall and the fall by a rise, they regard as an accident. We might just as well consider the fluctuations as the law and the determination of the price by cost of production as an accident, as is in fact done by certain other economists, which, that's for him like kind of like a subtle jab at other people who do this. But it is precisely these fluctuations which, viewed more closely, carry the most frightful devastation in their train, and, like an earthquake, cause bourgeois society to shake to its very foundations. It is precisely these fluctuations that force the price to conform to the cost of production. In the totality of this disorderly movement is to be found its order. In the total course of this industrial anarchy, in this circular movement, competition balances, as it were, the one extravagance by the other. So what seems to be taking place as pure chaos, if looked at in the larger structural view, turns out to not be so chaotic after all. We thus see that the price of a commodity is indeed determined by its cost of production, but in such a manner that the periods in which the price of these commodities rises above the costs of production are balanced by the periods in which it sinks below the cost of production, and vice versa. Of course, this does not hold good for a single given product of an industry, but only for the branch of industry, right? So we're not talking about the specific commodities. We're talking about the averages of the production of the commodities within the specific industry itself, right? So when you're talking about things systemically or structurally, the individual examples are all symptoms of these larger trends, and we cannot learn anything about the whole by only looking at the parts in isolation from one another, but we have to understand how they reciprocally determine one another in their development. So also, it does not hold good for an individual manufacturer, but only for the whole class of manufacturers. Okay, now we're almost at the end here. So the determination of price by cost of production is tantamount to the determination of price by the labor time required to the production of a commodity, for the cost of production consists first of raw materials and wear and tear of tools, etc., as in of industry products whose production has cost a certain number of work days, which therefore represent a certain amount of labor time, and secondly of direct labor, which is also measured by its duration. So this whole clause here where he's saying the production of commodities. So first there's the cost of the production. We're talking about raw materials. We're talking about the wear and tear of the tools. So we're talking about stuff that's already been built in the past. We're talking about resources that have already been mined or harvested. We're talking about, prepared. We're talking about a bunch of things that you, the capitalist, had to buy, or that, this capitalist in this example had to buy to be able to put there so that the laborer is able to make them into the products that are being sold. So that's what he calls dead labor. He calls it objective labor or dead labor, and it's called that because it's already been done. So, a lawnmower is the objectification of past labor because other laborers have already made it, right? So first there were the engineers, then there were the workers, and out of all of their collaboration comes this lawnmower. That's the objectification of labor that you have now as a lawnmower, or a factory is a bigger version of objectified labor. And then there's the cost of the reproduction of the objectified labor in the form of technology. But then there's also the laborers themselves who have to eat and drink and sleep. So that's what he's calling direct labor, which in other times he will call living labor. Okay, by what are wages determined, though? Now, the same general laws which regulate the price of commodities in general naturally regulate wages, or the price of labor power. Wages will now rise, now fall, according to the relation of supply and demand, according as competition shapes itself between the buyers of labor power, the capitalists, and the sellers of labor power, the workers. The fluctuations of wages correspond to the fluctuation in the price of commodities in general. But within the limits of these fluctuations, the price of labor power will be determined by the cost of production, by the labor time necessary for production of this commodity, labor power. What, then, is the cost of production of labor power? It is the cost required for the maintenance of the laborer as a laborer and for his education and training as a laborer. Notice it's not for the cost of his education and training as a citizen, or his education and training as a capitalist, or his education and training as a political ruler or an aristocrat. No, it's for his education and training as a laborer. And so, well, then why do they teach us English literature or art in school? Why is it that there are cool things taught in school that aren't just necessary for the reproduction of capital for some capitalist somewhere? Why is it that we get to study things that we find interesting sometimes? Well, because they couldn't get you to focus and pay attention and follow through on your homework assignments otherwise, if they didn't have some of these things be useful or interesting. But the real issue with education, which is part of what we got to in the last stream, was that this is not so much about the subjects themselves. Of course, teachers might do a good job of making it about the subjects themselves, but it's more about you learning how to take orders and be given assignments that you feel obligated and pressured to follow through on, and then you will be rated on your dependability and on the effort that you put into that during your off time when you're not there. So this is all just a perfect model for getting you to discipline yourself, getting society to discipline you, getting your parents to help discipline you to become a better laborer for whatever it is that you're going to be doing. So yeah, education and training in our society is for laborers to learn how to do things. So it's like, if you didn't like math, if you didn't like science, if you didn't like English literature, if you didn't like whatever it was that you were learning, it might not have just been the fact that it was a teacher. It could have also been the fact that you were learning it within an environment where the entire setup, its framework, and its direction, its goals are all geared towards the development or subjectivization, as they say, of you into a worker. And to the degree that you're really good at that, or that you're really bad at that, like if you're getting good grades or bad grades, for instance, that's how you and others are to measure your success in society. And so if you are lower in the hierarchy, but you are a lower graded student, then everyone goes, well, you just didn't work as hard for it. And so that's the sort of legitimation narrative of our society's mode of ideological reproduction. So it's saying, oh, you're legitimately earning less. You're legitimately not a part of the property holding class because that was your own fault, right? Well, okay, but since when in human history did people have to sit there all day, every day, and force themselves to pay attention to things that they weren't really interested in at the immediate moment. And how does that ability to focus on things that you're not interested in and then follow through on promises to, to do things, how's that a just or legitimate measure of your placement in society? Well, let's just assume that it is. Therefore, the shorter the time required for training up to a particular sort of work, the smaller is the cost of production of the worker, the lower is the price of his labor power, his wages. In those branches of industry in which hardly any period of apprenticeship is necessary and the mere bodily existence of the worker is sufficient, the cost of his production is limited almost exclusively to the commodities necessary for keeping him in working condition. The bare means of subsistence for someone who doesn't require any training is pretty low. The price of his work will therefore be determined by the price of the necessary means of subsistence, which is obviously why there's this huge motive for... I think I'm back. Gosh, this sucks. How long was it cut out for? Gosh, having functional internet is such a fucking privilege. Jeez. I miss it. I miss a functioning internet. Is anyone there? Hello? Hello? Is anybody there? Is anybody there? I think we're probably back. What I'll probably do is just replay the last few paragraphs with the robot reader while I step aside for a second, and then I'll be back to it. But yeah, I think we lost a few people because it disconnected for a bit like that. How long has it been like this? You back? Oh, I'm back. All right. Hello. Good to hear. Thank you. Guagasol. Hello. I was gone for 5 minutes. 15 seconds. Okay, I'm hearing different things, but I am back. Last time this happened, I talked for a fucking half hour. I think it was more like 40 minutes in that critical pedagogy live stream that I did. There's about 40 minutes missing before I realized that my roommate had unplugged the router. I don't think that happened this time, but it could have. It could have been reset because it was getting so slow in the house. All right, so I'm going to go right back to it. I'm going to scroll up and just let it play from like right here. So what did you all hear me talking about relations and what makes do we talk about a slave is only a slave within a certain historical, political, and economic set of conditions? Do we talk about how an entity is not just an entity dependent on its sort of self-standing traits or characteristics or essential components that make it what it is, but it's also in a sort of sense determined by its placement within a system of other things that make sense of it, so that our sense, the significance that we see in anything is somewhat dependent on its placement in a set of relations? Do we talk about all that? I'm going to go ahead and just jump right back into where he's talking about those relations. I'm going to let this read for a second while I step aside. I want to make sure that things are working. I got to get a hold of my roommate and make sure that this stuff's not getting unplugged again. These social relations between the producers and the conditions under which they exchange their activities and share in the total act of production will naturally vary according to the character of the means of production. Which is just a way of saying that it's relative to the set of conditions that it is inside of. Yeah, for anybody who is probably like 15 or 20 minutes behind and watching the video, you might not have even really seen any change.
Hence, social relations between the producers and the conditions under which they exchange their activities and share in the total act of production will naturally vary according to the character of the means of production. With the discovery of a new instrument of warfare, the firearm, the whole internal organization of the army was necessarily altered. The relations within which individuals compose an army and can work as an army were transformed, and the relation of different armies to another was likewise changed. We thus see that the social relations within which individuals produce, the social relations of production, are altered, transformed, with the change and development of the material means of production, of the forces of production. The relations of production in their totality constitute what is called the social relations, society, and, moreover, a society at a definite stage of historical development, a society with peculiar, distinctive characteristics. Ancient society, feudal society, bourgeois or capitalist society, are such totalities of relations of production, each of which denotes a particular stage of development in the history of mankind. Capital also is a social relation of production. It is a bourgeois relation of production, a relation of bourgeois society. The means of subsistence, the instruments of labor, the raw materials, of which capital consists, have they not been produced and accumulated under given social conditions, with indefinite special relations? Are they not employed for new production, under given special conditions, with indefinite social relations? And does not just the definite social character stamp the products which serve for new production as capital? Capital consists not only of means of subsistence, instruments of labor, and raw materials, not only as material products. It consists just as much of exchange values. All products of which it consists are commodities. Capital, consequently, is not only a sum of material products, it is a sum of commodities, of exchange values, of social magnitudes. Capital remains the same whether we put cotton in the place of wool, rice in the place of wheat, steamships in the place, provided only that the cotton, the rice, the steamships, the body of capital, have the same exchange value, the same price, as the wool, the wheat, the railroads, in which it was previously embodied. The bodily form of capital may transform itself continually, while capital does not suffer the least alteration. But
Okay, basic point is that capital cannot be understood by just looking at a pile of products or goods or even a stack of cash. It doesn't make any sense out of a set of contextual relations. That's all that's really saying. But though every capital is a sum of commodities, i.e., of exchange values, it does not follow that every sum of commodities of exchange values is capital. Every sum of exchange values is an exchange value. Each particular exchange value is a sum of exchange values. For example, a house worth £1,000 or $240,000 for that matter is an exchange of value of $240,000, which would be its equivalent. You could transfer or exchange for that value in some other sum of products. A piece of paper worth 1 penny is a sum of exchange values of 1/100th of a penny. Products which are exchangeable for others are commodities. The definite proportion in which they are exchangeable forms their exchange value, or expressed in money, their price. The quantity of these products can have no effect on their character as commodities, as representing an exchange value, as having a certain price. Whether a tree be large or small, it remains a tree. Whether we exchange iron in pennyweights or in hundredweights for other products, does this alter its character, its being a commodity or exchange value? According to the quantity, it is a commodity of greater or of lesser value, of higher or of lower price. How then does the sum of commodities of exchange values become capital? Thereby, that as an independent social power, in other words, as the power of a part of society, it preserves itself and multiplies by exchange with direct living labor power. The existence of a class which possesses nothing but the ability to work is a necessary presupposition of capital. It's a really important part right there, because the existence of a class which presupposes nothing but the ability to work is a necessary presupposition of capital. Keep that in mind, because any society that calls itself socialist or communist that presupposes the existence of a class of people whose only real function is to work would still be capitalism. Yeah. It is only the dominion of past accumulated materialized labor over immediate living labor that stamps the accumulated labor with the character of capital. Capital does not consist in the fact that accumulated labor serves living labor as a means for new production. It consists in the fact that living labor serves accumulated labor as the means of preserving and multiplying its exchange value. How much left? Are we there? We're more than halfway through. I know we are. We're more than halfway through. I think we'll be done in about 40 minutes. Maybe? Geez, well, how long could this stream possibly go on for? How? Yeah, okay. It's like 3 more pages. All right, we got this. Pages. They're longer than pages, obviously. All right. Relation of wage labor to capital. What is it that takes place in the exchange between the capitalist and the wage laborer? The laborer receives a means of subsistence in exchange for his labor power. The capitalist receives, in exchange for his means of subsistence, labor, the productive activity of the laborer, the creative force by which the worker not only replaces what he consumes, but also gives to the accumulated labor a greater value than it previously possessed. The laborer gets from the capitalist a portion of the existing means of subsistence. For what purpose do these means of subsistence serve him? For immediate consumption. But as soon as I consume means of subsistence, they are irrevocably lost to me, unless I employ the time during which these means sustain my life in producing new means of subsistence, in creating by my labor new values in place of the values lost in consumption. But it is just this noble reproduction power that the laborer surrenders to the capitalist in exchange for means of subsistence received. Consequently, he has lost it for himself. A week traded away towards someone else's profit is not a week where you get to really do things for yourself. Let us take an example. For 1 shilling, a laborer works all day long in the fields of a farmer, to whom he thus secures a return of 2 shillings. The farmer not only receives the replaced value, which he has given to the day laborer, he has doubled it. Therefore, he has consumed the 1 shilling that he gave to the day laborer in a fruitful, productive manner. For the 1 shilling, he has bought the labor power of the day laborer, which creates products of the soil of twice the value, and out of 1 shilling makes 2. The day laborer, on the contrary, receives in the place of his productive force, whose results he has just surrendered to the farmer, 1 shilling, which he exchanges for means of subsistence, which he consumes more or less quickly. The 1 shilling has therefore been consumed in a double manner. Reproductively for the capitalist, for it has been exchanged for labor power, which brought forth 2 shillings. Unproductively for the worker, for it has been exchanged for means of subsistence which are lost forever, and whose value he can obtain again only by repeating the same exchange with the farmer. So you just have to keep paying rent over and over and over again. You just have to keep buying food over and over and over again. Survival keeps taking your entire week just to achieve, even though it should only take half of your week. What's going on with the other half of your week? It's creating profit for someone else. Capital, therefore, presupposes wage labor. Wage labor presupposes capital. They condition each other. Each brings the other into existence. Does a worker in a cotton factory produce only cotton? No, he produces capital. He produces values which serve anew to command his work and to create by means of its new values. Capital can multiply itself only by exchanging itself for labor power, by calling wage labor into life. The labor power of the wage laborer can exchange itself for capital only by increasing capital, by strengthening that very power whose slave it is. Increase of capital, therefore, is increase of the proletariat, that is to say, of the working class. And so the bourgeoisie and its economists maintain that the interest of the capitalist and the laborer is the same. And in fact, so they are. The worker perishes if capital does not keep him busy. Capital perishes if it does not exploit labor power, which, in order to exploit, it must buy. The more quickly the capital destined for production, the productive capital, increases, the more prosperous industry is. The more the bourgeoisie enriches itself, the better business gets. So many more workers does the capitalist need, so much the dearer does the worker sell himself. The fastest possible growth of productive capital is, therefore, the indispensable condition for a tolerable life to the laborer. But what is growth of productive capital? Growth of the power of accumulated labor over living labor. Growth of the rule of the bourgeoisie over the working class. When wage labor produces the alien wealth dominating it, the power hostile to it, capital, there flow back to it in its means of employment. In other words, its means of subsistence, under the condition that it again becomes a part of capital, become again the lever whereby capital is to be forced into an accelerated, expansive movement. To say that the interests of capital and the interests of the workers are identical signifies only this, that capital and wage labor are two sides of one and the same relation. Capital and wage labor are two sides of the same coin, so to speak. The one conditions the other in the same way that the usurer and the borrower condition each other. So the usurer being the lender, the borrower, the debtor. As long as the wage laborer remains a wage laborer, his lot is dependent upon capital. That is what the boasted community of interests between worker and capitalists amounts to. If capital grows, the mass of wage labor grows. The number of wage workers increases. In a word, the sway of capital extends over a greater mass of individuals. Let us suppose the most favorable case. If productive capital grows, the demand for labor grows. It therefore increases the price of labor power, which is to say wages. A house may be large or small. As long as the neighboring houses are likewise small, it satisfies all social requirement for a residence. But let there arise next to the little house a palace, and the little house shrinks to a hut. The little house now makes it clear that its inmate has no social position at all to maintain, or but a very insignificant one, and however high it may shoot up in the course of civilization, if the neighboring palace rises in equal or even in greater measure, the occupant of the relatively little house will always find himself more uncomfortable, more dissatisfied, more cramped within his four walls. I really want to quick see if there's The Good Place, little house next to palace. See if I can find that picture from one of the first episodes of The Good Place. Yeah, right here. So there was this scene where, it's in the afterlife, and Eleanor has this tiny little house, and she's, come on, I don't care, proceed. And she's, she already doesn't like the little house, and then she comes outside and she sees that it's right beside this mansion, this huge extravagant house. I'll just show it here. You can see it like that, right? Everyone can see that. The little house is here on the left. It's the yellow and blue. The big house is on the right here. And anyway, if you've not seen The Good Place, make sure to watch it. It's a great show. But anyway, it's just a good example. So it's like you can have a house and it can be small and humble and it's fine. And maybe you want a little bit bigger of a house or something. But when someone else sets up a really big house next to it, now you really look like you are lesser in society, right? So this is just getting at how things are relatively determined. So the little house now makes it clear that it's blah, 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 blah. Yeah. So now he's going to be more cramped in his four walls. And appreciable rise in wages presupposes a rapid growth of productive capital. Rapid growth of productive capital calls forth just as rapid a growth of wealth, of luxury, of social needs, and social pleasures. Therefore, although the pleasures of the laborer have increased, the social gratification which they afford has fallen in comparison with the increased pleasures of the capitalist, which are inaccessible to the worker in comparison with the stage of development of society in general. So even though we get to have nice things, relatively speaking, hell, maybe you get to have internet, air conditioner, iPhone, whatever. The question is are you able to do things that other people get to do? Are your opportunities remaining relatively what they would have been 20, 50, 100 years ago? And so people like Steven Pinker make a career going around telling people everything's just getting better all the time, and everybody's average level of living has just gone up. Okay, yeah, because you're comparing it against some standard from probably 150 years ago and you're not keeping into account like how these things are relative right now. So in the same way, we might say in 50 years from now, when the rich are able to extend their lives by like 250 years or something, and average workers are living to be 90, they'll be like, well, you're still living longer, right? Compared to 100 years ago, you're getting to live like an extra 15 years compared to what you were living to on average. So why are you complaining? It's like, yeah, well, it doesn't really make a difference when the wealthy are living 250 years longer than the workers are. Still relevant today. Our wants and pleasures have their origin in society. We therefore measure them in relation to society. We do not measure them in relation to the objects which serve for their gratification. Since they are of a social nature, they are of a relative nature.
Amazing.
But wages are not at all determined merely by the sum of commodities for which they may be exchanged. Other factors enter into the problem. What the workers directly receive for their labor power is a certain sum of money. Are wages determined merely by this money price? In the 16th century, the gold and silver circulation in Europe increased in consequence of the discovery of richer and more easily worked mines in America. The value of gold and silver therefore fell in relation to other commodities. The workers received the same amount of coined silver for their labor power as before. The money price of their work remained the same, and yet their wages had fallen. For in exchange for the same amount of silver, they obtained a smaller amount of other commodities, which, by the way, is inflation. And so you're getting paid. Let's just say that you get like 2 raises at a pizza shop, and those raises got you like are getting you paid $1 more than when you were hired. But compared to your purchasing power a few years ago, you're actually getting paid less than you would have been getting a few years ago. So that's inflation at work. This was one of the circumstances which furthered the growth of capital, the rise of the bourgeoisie in the 18th century. Let us take another case. In the winter of 1847, in consequence of bad harvests, the most indispensable means of subsistence, grains, meat, butter, cheese, rose greatly in price. Let us suppose that the workers still received the same sum of money for their labor power as before. Did not their wages fall? To be sure. For the same money they received in exchange less bread, meat, etc. Their wages fell, not because the value of silver was less, but because the value of the means of subsistence had increased, right? So that was part of the issue with populism, the Populist Party back in the 1870s and 1880s. Over time, it became a sort of like, we want free silver and to be removed from the gold standard. Arguably, it did need to be removed from the gold standard. That is an arguable thing. People could say that just causes more inflation. There's a whole conversation there to have with MMT people and whatnot. I don't really care. For our purposes here, though, the basic point is that the Marx would have said that those populist workers were focusing merely on what they're getting paid, and they weren't thinking about how the value of what they're getting paid only makes sense within a broader framework or context or set of relations within which their value is derived or designated. Finally, let us suppose that the money price of labor power remained the same, while all agriculture and manufactured commodities had fallen in price because of the employment of new machines, of favorable seasons, etc. For the same money, the workers could now buy more commodities of all kinds. Their wages have therefore risen, just because their money value has not changed. The money price of labor power, the nominal wages, do not therefore coincide with the actual or real wages. So the real wages would be what you're able to actually get with that money, i.e. with the amount of commodities which are actually given in exchange for the wages. If then we speak of a rise or fall of wages, we have to keep in mind not only the money price of labor power, the nominal wages, but also the real wages. But neither the nominal wages, i.e. the amount of money for which the laborer sells himself to the capitalist, nor the real wages, i.e. the amount of commodities which he can buy for this money, exhausts the relations which are comprehended in the term wages. Wages are more than that. Wages are determined above all by their relations to the gain, the profit of the capitalist. In other words, wages are a proportionate relative quantity. So like, you know how like people can be like, oh, well, everything's relative. Yeah, and that's why structuralists always are trying to develop methodologies and conceptual apparatuses to be able to still make sense of things in a world that is constantly fluctuating and oscillating, wherein everything is relatively determined by a lot of moving parts. That's part of the task of critical, or that's the task of political economy and of its critique through Marx, is to figure out how to make sense of all of these relative moving variables. Real wages express the price of labor power in relation to the price of commodities. Relative wages, on the other hand, express the share of immediate labor in the value newly created by it in relation to the share of it which falls to accumulated labor, to capital. Getting it? The general law that determines the rise and fall of wages and profits. Still going strong. Is anyone even here yet? Or still? Okay, there's two, I think two, maybe three of these left, but some of them are shorter than other ones. Not that it matters. I know that a lot of you are in for the long haul. You're probably listening while working. You're probably driving long haul, or stocking shelves at night, or on your way to work or back, walking between buildings, whatever it might be. So if you're listening on the go, I hope that this is not all just a blur of words like commodities and exchange and production and labor power, and instead that it will kind of start to make sense how all of this is working together. The more times you return to this, the more sense it'll make. We have said wages are not a share of the worker in the commodities produced by him. Wages are that part of already existing commodities with which the capitalist buys a certain amount of productive labor power. But the capitalist must replace these wages out of the price for which he sells the product made by the worker. He must so replace it that, as a rule, there remains to him a surplus above the cost of production expended by him. That is, he must gain a profit. Surplus just means extra. The over and above, the additional value beyond just the mere inputs, right? The leftover. The profit is a sort of leftover. A leftover of what? The selling price of the commodities produced by the worker is divided, from the point of view of the capitalist, into three parts. First, the replacement of the price of the raw materials advanced by him in addition to the replacement of the wear and tear of the tools, machines, and other instruments of labor likewise advanced by him. Second, the replacement of the wages advanced. And third, the surplus left over. In other words, the profit of the capitalist. While the first part merely replaces previously existing values, it is evident that the replacement of the wages and the surplus, the profit of capital, are as a whole taken out of the new value, which is produced by the labor of the worker and added to the raw materials. And in this sense, we can view wages as well as profit for the purpose of comparing them with each other as shares in the product of the worker. Real wages may remain the same. They may even rise. Nevertheless, the relative wages may fall. Let us suppose, for instance, that all means of subsistence, the stuff you need to be able to survive, have fallen 2/3 in price, while the day's wages have fallen 1/3, for example, from 3 to 2 shillings. Although the worker can now get a greater amount of commodities with these 2 shillings than he formerly did with 3 shillings, yet his wages have decreased in proportion to the gain of the capitalist. The profit of the capitalist, the manufacturers, for instance, has increased 1 shilling, which means that for a smaller amount of exchange values, which he pays to the worker, the latter must produce a greater amount of exchange values than before. The share of capitals in proportion to the share of labor has risen. The distribution of social wealth between capital and labor has become still more unequal. The capitalist commands a greater amount of labor with the same capital. The power of the capitalist class over the working class has grown. The social position of the worker has become worse, has been forced down still another degree below that of the capitalist. So even though you're seeing more buying power, you're able to get a little bit more bread or beer or whatever in your week, your actual buying power when it comes to capital and what can be invested and how much return you can expect from that investment, is diminishing in respect to the capitalists you're working for, because if you're seeing a relative increase in your purchasing power, they are seeing a dramatically larger increase in their capital, which is exactly what we're talking about. Is this with the whole thing with the big house against the little house, right? Even though you live in an advanced country, a highly advanced country where you have access to all of these things. Oh, okay, except that you will never have time, energy, or much extra money to actually really be able to do all of those things. And you'll just get told that you should be grateful because you have internet and an iPhone, when in reality, an iPhone is just a way to stay distracted because you're not able to go skiing. Like the ruling class, they're able to go skiing, so they're not on their phones as much. They're off doing fun things while you're basically just recovering from work, laying there on the couch, wishing that you weren't alive or whatever. Jessidiah says, listening while working. Hell yeah. Good to see. Good to see. I know I'll be listening to this in the future at some point while I'm working as well. Hell yeah. They stand. What kind of work are you doing, by the way? I'm just curious. Is anyone else working right now? They stand in inverse proportion to each other. The share of profit increases in the same proportion in which the share of labor wages falls, and vice versa. Profit rises in the same degree in which wages fall. It falls in the same degree in which wages rise. It might perhaps be argued that the capitalist class can gain by an advantageous exchange of his products with other capitalists, by a rise in the demand for his commodities, whether in consequence of the opening up of new markets or in consequence of temporarily increased demands in the old market, and so on. That the profit of the capitalist, therefore, may be multiplied by taking advantage of other capitalists, independently of the rise and fall of wages, of the exchange value of labor power, or that the profit of the capitalist may also rise through improvements in the instruments of labor, new applications of the forces of nature, and so on. But in the first place, it must be admitted that the results remain the same, although brought about in an opposite manner. Profit, indeed, has not risen above wages, has not risen because wages have fallen, but wages have fallen because profit has risen. With the same amount of another man's labor, the capitalist has bought a larger amount of exchange values without having paid more for the labor on that account, i.e., the work is paid for less in proportion to the net gain which it yields to the capitalist. In the second place, it must be borne in mind that, despite the fluctuations in the prices of commodities, the average price of every commodity, the proportion in which it exchanges for other commodities, is determined by its cost of production. The acts of overreaching and taking advantage of one another within the capitalist ranks necessarily equalize themselves. The improvements of machinery, the new applications of the forces of nature in the service of production, make it possible to produce in a given period of time, with the same amount of labor and capital, a larger amount of products, but in no wise a larger amount of exchange values. If by the use of the spinning machine I can furnish twice as much yarn in an hour as before its invention, for instance 100 pounds instead of 50 pounds, in the long run I receive back in exchange for this 100 pounds no more commodities than I did before for 50, because the cost of production has fallen by half, or because I can furnish double the product at the same cost. Right? So that new machine being introduced into your industry has not made it so that you have to work half as long, so you get to have the rest of the week to go skiing or read philosophy or, learn cultural dances or whatever. No, you work just as much. It doesn't matter. So do you see, so maybe you get a little raise, like 50 cents. Yeah. In the meantime, that capitalist is raking in some profit. And so every time you're getting that raise, they're making out like they're making a killing over and above what you are, unless the competition at that time is really high, and all of the corners are being cut in every way. In which case, then we will go out of business if we don't stay competitive, and so we really can't give you a raise. And we really have to even redirect most of our profits towards the research and development just so that we can stay competitive. And then, capitalists will use that as a justification of their system by saying that that keeps commodities prices cheaper and lower so that people have more purchasing power in the market. But Marx is basically laying out how that's relative. It's relative. Finally, in whatsoever proportion the capitalist class, whether of one country or the entire world market, distribute the net revenue of production among themselves, the total amount of this net revenue always consists exclusively of the amount by which accumulated labor has been increased from the proceeds of direct labor. This whole amount, therefore, grows in the same proportion in which labor augments capital, meaning in the same proportion in which profit rises as compared with wages. Oh my God. Wow. So David Lester says, working from home with my PC while listening here, often pausing from work to excerpts that catch my attention. Hey, hell yeah. Izul's got to go. I trust there will be a VOD. There will be a VOD. So thanks for coming by. So happy you were here for a little while. It's great to see you. I hope that you have a good time doing whatever it is that you have to go do now. And yes, this will be here on demand in the future, which is what VOD means for anyone who didn't know. Video on demand. This video will be available to meet your demand. Next section. The interests of capital and wage labor are diametrically opposed. Effect of growth of productive capital on wages. Okay, so this is a really important part here. The interests of capital and wage labor are diametrically opposed. So sometimes people try to talk about class as though class is just another thing alongside other things like other vectors of oppression like race and gender. And in a sort of sense it is, in the sense that discrimination and prejudice does impact you in ways relative to your class standing or to your race or to your gender. In that way, they're all equivalent or analogous, at least. But when we're doing this critique of political economy thing that Marx is doing right here, we're talking about something beyond discrimination and prejudice. We're talking about the interests of an entire class in society not being something that can be dialectically sort of worked out or synthesized. So, for instance, you could say that there's an unequal share of precarity allocated to people of certain skin pigmentations, or of privilege to people who are white, or of men or of women. You're going to see different amounts of precarity or of opportunity or of respect or of representation in society. Sure. But the goal is to get it to the point where we're able to all actualize ourselves regardless of our gender or of our sexual orientation or of our race. To understand that the social construction of how people have tended to think about those things was really just a sort of legitimation narrative, so that people were using your gender, sexual orientation, or race or class standing as a way of making sense of where you fit into the sort of hierarchy of society. That's stuff operating at the level of ideology that definitely impacts people at a material level and results in things like longer prison sentences, higher rates of incarceration, earlier deaths, etc. Sure. And so that's kind of where intersectionality comes in and deals with things. But what we're getting at here is not. It's different, because if the interests of capital and wage labor are diametrically opposed, that's not the same as saying that the interests of white and black people are diametrically opposed. Actually, that's not true. The interests of white and black people are not diametrically opposed. We have shared interests, like we want our kids to be able to live like good lives. We want to be able to own homes. We want to be able to lead a life with dignity. So there is a form of socially constructed pure ideology used as a sort of legitimating narrative for some people to think that they deserve certain privileges at other people's expense, and that other people don't really deserve respect or recognition or whatever, right? But then there's capital and wage labor, which are diametrically opposed. They can't sit down at the table and eventually see eye to eye. Like men and women can work together. Capitalists and wage laborers can't work together. That's the point. We thus see that even if we keep ourselves within the relation of capital and wage labor, the interests of capitals and the interests of wage labor are diametrically opposed to each other. A rapid growth of capital is synonymous with a rapid growth of profits. Profits can grow rapidly only when the price of labor, the relative wages, decrease just as rapidly. Relative wages may fall, although real wages rise simultaneously with nominal wages, with the money value of labor, provided only that the real wage does not rise in the same proportion as a profit. If, for instance, in good business, year's wages rise 5%, while profits rise 30%, the relative wage has not increased, but decreased. Okay? That's kind of a good summary of the last section. If, therefore, the income of the worker increased with the rapid growth of capital, there is at the same time a widening of the social chasm that divides the worker from the capitalist, and increases in the power of capital over labor, a greater dependence of labor upon capital. To say that the worker has an interest in the rapid growth of capital means only this, that the more speedily the worker augments the wealth of the capitalist, the larger will be the crumbs which fall to him. The greater will be the number of workers than can be called into existence, the more can the mass of slaves dependent upon capital be increased. We have thus seen that even the most favorable situation for the working class, namely the most rapid growth of capital, however much it may improve the material life of the worker, does not abolish the antagonism between his interests and the interests of the capitalist. Profit and wages remain, as before, in inverse proportion. If capital grows rapidly, wages may rise, but the profit of capital rises disproportionately faster. The material position of the worker has improved, but at the cost of his social position. The social chasm that separates him from the capitalist has widened. Finally, to say that the most favorable condition for wage labor is the fastest possible growth of productive capital is the same as to say the quicker the working class multiplies and augments the power inimical to it, the wealth of another which lords over that class, the more favorable will be the conditions under which it will be permitted to toil anew at the multiplication of bourgeois wealth, at the enlargement of the power of capital, content thus to forge for itself the golden chains by which the bourgeoisie drags it in its train. That is a really good paragraph. And almost that whole paragraph is one sentence. So if you can't wrap your head around it, then you're a little
beta.
Just kidding. It's actually
disgusting.
And you might want to spend a little bit of time reading and rereading it. But for now, let's just focus on a couple of these sort of extra words like define inimical.
Inimical.
Tending to obstruct or harm. Okay? Tending to obstruct or harm. Augments. We've been using this one a little bit. Let's look that one up really quick. Because I think it just means making changes.
Augment.
Make something greater by adding to it. Increase. So augment it doesn't just mean making changes, but it means making positive changes. Okay. Except for in this situation, which is the quicker the working class multiplies and augments the power inimical to it, meaning the wealth of another which lords over that class, the more favorable will be the conditions under which it will be permitted to toil anew at the multiplication of bourgeois wealth, at the enlargement of the power of capital, content thus to forge for itself the golden chains by which the bourgeoisie drags it in its train. Beautiful prose. Growth of productive capital and rise of wages Are they really so indissolubly united as the bourgeois economists maintain? We must not believe their mere words. We dare not believe them even when they claim that the fatter capital is the more will... We dare not believe them even when they claim that the fatter capital is the more will its slave be pampered. The bourgeoisie is too much enlightened. It keeps its accounts much too carefully to share the prejudices of the feudal lord, who makes an ostentatious display of the significance or the magnificence of his retinue. The conditions of existence of the bourgeoisie compel it to attend carefully to its bookkeeping. We must therefore examine more closely into the following question. And here's the kind of part 2 of this section. In what manner does the growth of productive capital affect wages? Oh, Literature is also working from home. I work as an accessibility specialist, so I'm just coding PDFs for assistive tech. Kind of mindless work sometimes. Hell yeah! That's good. Good to hear. In what manner does the growth of productive capital affect wages? If, as a whole, the productive capital of bourgeois society grows, there takes place a more many-sided accumulation of labor. The individual capitals increase in number and in magnitude. The multiplications of individual capitals increases the competition among capitalists. The increasing magnitude of increasing capitals provides the means of leading more powerful armies of workers with more gigantic instruments of war upon the industrial battlefield. The one capitalist can drive the other from the field and carry off his capital only by selling more cheaply. In order to sell more cheaply without ruining himself, he must produce more cheaply, as in increase the productive forces of labor as much as possible. Solitary. But the productive forces of labor is increased above all by a greater division of labor and by a more general introduction and constant improvement of machinery. The larger the army of workers among whom the labor is subdivided, the more gigantic the scale upon which machinery is introduced, the more in proportion does the cost of production decrease, the more fruitful is the labor. And so there arises among the capitalists a universal rivalry for the increase of the division of labor and of machinery and for their exploitation upon the greatest possible scale. This is getting into the stuff we had touched on earlier about how science and technology are sort of guided by this profit motive, to the extent that the plan is not we're not developing technology that would free people from having to work. We're developing technologies that will make it so that while you work for basically the exact same amount of time and basically the same amount of wages, you're producing a shit ton more profit than you were before, but you're basically getting paid the same. And with inflation, sometimes that's just a diminishment over like what you're actually able to buy with that purchasing power. So if now, by a greater division of labor, by the application and improvement of new machines, by a more advantageous exploitation of the forces of nature on a larger scale, a capitalist has found the means of producing with the same amount of labor, whether it be direct or accumulated labor, which would be either a worker or a machine, a larger amount of products of commodities than his competitors. This is a long fucking sentence. If, for instance, he can produce a whole yard of linen in the same labor time in which his competitors weave half a yard, how will this capitalist act? He could keep on selling half a yard of linen at old market price, but this would not have the effect of driving his opponents from the field and enlarging his own market, right? So let's just say that you, instead of, 10 burgers per hour, you're able to, with this new machine, now make, 50 burgers per hour. But with the you're still paying that worker the same amount of money. And so after you've taken into account the cost of the machine, which was probably less than the labor that it replaced because it replaced a bunch of workers, now like what is made over and above, if you keep selling at the old market value of those burgers, is, that's a profit margin that you could pocket in the short term and go spend on your friends and have a party on some island somewhere. Woo! But that's not how capitalists tend to go, because that's more like how feudal lords would squander their wealth with big celebrations where they got to be the fucking badass lord, and everybody was like, wow, this person's awesome, giving away all these gifts. No, instead, here you are working the, you've made everything more productive. You're producing way more than you were for the same price, or something close to the same price. And so you could keep selling at that same level, but that wouldn't drive the competitors out of business. And you actually need to, because if you don't soon, then they probably will to you. So it's like this, it's kind of like the prisoner's dilemma. Okay. And so you instead lower your prices. And because you've lowered your prices, the competitors are going to be in a really hard situation for a little while. And they're either going to have to get upgrade their means of production and processes of production like you have, or they're going to have to kick the bucket. But his need of a market has increased in the same measure in which his productive power has extended. The more powerful and costly means of production that he has called into existence enable him, it is true, to sell his wares more cheaply, but they compel him at the same time to sell more wares, to get control of a very much greater market for his commodities. Consequently, this capitalist will sell his half yard of linen more cheaply than his competitors. But the capitalist will not sell the whole yard so cheaply as his competitors sell the half yard, although the production of the whole yard costs him no more than does that of the half yard to the others. Otherwise, he would make no extra profit and would get back in exchange only the cost of production. He might obtain a greater income from having set in motion a larger capital, but not from having made a greater profit on his capital than the others. Moreover, he attains the object he is aiming at if he prices his goods only a small percentage lower than his competitors. He drives them off the field. He wrests from them at least part of their market by underselling them. And finally, let us remember that the current price always stands either above or below the cost of production, according as the sale of commodity takes place in the favorable or unfavorable period of the industry. Which, by the way, implies that every industry has favorable and unfavorable periods when either there's a lot of capital coming in or a lot of capital going out. During the times when you've got a bust cycle or the bust end of a cycle, it's going to be you're selling commodities for less than their cost of production. So you're taking a loss and you're just trying to stay afloat. And so that's when layoffs come. That's when you start replacing people with machines. It's those times that you are saving some of that profit to be able to survive through. It's those times that you were researching and developing new processes so that you can cut better corners for. So the boom and bust cycle is kind of central to the entire analysis for that reason. According as the market price of the yard of linen stands above or below its former cost of production, will the percentage vary at which the capitalist who has made use of the new and more faithful means of production sell above his real cost of production. But the privilege of our capitalists is not of long duration. Other competing capitalists introduce the same machines, the same division of labor, and introduce them upon the same or even upon a greater scale. And finally, this introduction becomes so universal that the price of the linen is lowered not only below its old, but even below its new cost of production. You're doing excellent. I really appreciate your effort with this. Thanks, says Jesidiah. Thank you. Appreciate that. That's some straight heat from Marx, says Half-Truth. Yes. Yes. The capitalists therefore finds themselves in their mutual relations in the same situation in which they were before the introduction of the new means of production. And if they are by these means enabled to offer double the product of the old price, they are now forced to furnish double the product for less than the old price. Having arrived at the new point, the new cost of production, the battle for supremacy in the market has to be fought out anew. Given more division of labor and more machinery, and the results a greater scale upon which division of labor and machinery are exploited. Oh wait, I said that as like it was a middle clause in a sentence when actually it was the last clause. But because this is the last 3 sentences or so of this section, I'm going to go ahead and just reread that. Given more division of labor and more machinery, and there results a greater scale upon which division of labor and machinery are exploited. It's just the word "and" is throwing me off. Given more division of labor and more machinery, there results a greater scale upon which division of labor and machinery are exploited. There we go. And competition, again, brings the same reaction against this result. Okay, is this the last section? I think so. Yes, last section. Effect of capitalist competition on the capitalist class, the middle class, and the working class. I really hope that in the near future, someone will come back to this and timestamp all of these section headers and make a nice little index. If you don't do it, eventually I'll eventually do it. Max Emiligen says, love this channel, comrade. Best lefty theory channel on YouTube. High praise. That is high praise. Meaning you must be you must be high to be saying such things. Anyway, all right. Effective capitalist competition on the capitalist class, the middle class, and the working class. We thus see how the method of production and the means of production are constantly enlarged, revolutionized, how division of labor necessarily draws after it greater division of labor, the employment of machinery, greater employment of machinery, work upon a large scale, work upon a still greater scale. This is the law that continually throws capitalist production out of its old ruts and compels capital to strain ever more the productive forces of labor for the very reason that it has already strained them. The law that grants it no respite and constantly shouts in its ear, "March! March!" This is no other law than that which, within the periodical fluctuations of commerce, necessarily adjusts the price of a commodity to its cost of production. I think he means the law of value. No matter how powerful the means of production which a capitalist may bring into the field, competition will make their adoption general. And from the moment that they have been generally adopted, the sole result of the greater productiveness of his capital will be that he must furnish at the same price 10, 20, 100 times as much as before. But since he must find a market for perhaps 1,000 times as much in order to outweigh the lower selling price by the greater quantity of the sale, since now a more extensive sale is necessary not only to gain a greater profit, but also in order to replace the cost of production, the instrument of production itself grows always more costly, as we have seen. And since this more extensive sale has become a question of life and death, not only for him, but also for his rivals, the old struggle must begin again, and it is all the more violent and more powerful the means of production already invented are. The division of labor and the application of machinery will therefore take a fresh start and upon an even greater scale. So this gets to the multiplication of the forces of production and how they are developed and refined and enhanced faster and faster. And, you know, that's obviously a part of that is what we like. You know, that's not a bad thing purely, right? More stuff is good, right? The question is one of quality. Are we able to enjoy those things? Do we have time and energy to be able to enjoy those things? Do we have time and energy to be able to do things that you cannot purchase the labor of others to do for you? I can pay someone to mow the lawn for me because I'm too busy working. I can pay someone to do the siding on the house. I can pay someone to cook my meals, but I cannot pay someone else to play the violin for me. Oh, I could have someone else literally play the violin for me. But if I have a natural talent or a calling to be able to develop that skill, I cannot pay someone else to develop that skill for me, right? Nobody else can die in my place. Nobody else, you know, I will eventually have to die and I will have to do that myself. I can't pay someone else to die for me. I can't pay someone else to build relationships for me. And I can't pay someone else to play the violin for me. So there are things that money can buy. Your time and energy can be your time energy that is overwritten or undermined by the law of value that determines in society that all of your time and energy will be measured by its ability to be exchanged in a market for other people's goods and services. All of that it doesn't take into account the fact that there are certain types of activities, life activities, as Marx would say, that if you're paying other people to do it for you, then you're missing out. Okay. And, you know, if you have a talent for something and then you never build skills on that talent, If you feel a calling towards something and you're never able to pursue that, yeah, no amount of money that you make is going to be able to satisfy the fucking emptiness inside of you that is hollowed out by the exchange of all of your time energy into labor power, leaving nothing but energy without time, or time without energy. Either way, you aren't able to put in sustained effort towards the things that you feel called to do, towards the relationships you feel called to build, or towards the loved ones in your life who you need to be around, investing time, energy, and attention to be able to actually like get to know. So this is obviously how parents who have to work a lot aren't able to really raise their kids. This is about how kids who aren't really getting attention or investment of time and energy from parents or teachers are being neglected, and their development is going to be less than functional as a result of that. And no amount of money is able to correct for that. So you could be a rich kid, and because mommy and daddy are also so busy all the time just maintaining their status in society, sure, you're able to buy better meals and have all of the sweet video game consoles and able to go off and do things with your quote-unquote peers, but humans aren't human in peer groups. Humans are human in society, and peer groups are a way of separating people from the larger context and making them think that they're alive when in reality they're really just hanging out with other people, doing things that animals also do. Really, that's what commodities are all about. What can be commodified are the things necessary to meet animal needs. What cannot be commodified are those things that in the university scene get called the arts and humanities. But also, you know, science, technology, insofar as you wanted to pursue those things just to better understand the world, also that is something that you're not able to develop. So it's where, I mean, Marx is where all of my time energy analysis ultimately is derived from, except I do it through, I have a sort of existential phenomenological approach that I get through existentialists and phenomenologists in addition to the Marxian analysis. So anyway, I'm writing a book about it. I think. I hope. I mean, I'm writing like 3 books about it. I'm trying to narrow it down to 1 though. All right. The division of labor and the application of machinery will therefore take a fresh start and upon an even greater scale. Whatever be the power of the means of production which are employed, competition seeks to rob capital of the golden fruits of this power by reducing the price of commodities to the cost of production, in the same measure in which production is cheapened, i.e., in the same measure in which more can be produced with the same amount of labor. It compels by a law which is irresistible a still greater cheapening of production, the sale of ever greater masses of product for smaller prices. Thus, the capitalist will have gained nothing more by his efforts than the obligation to furnish a greater product in the same labor time. In a word, more difficult conditions for the profitable employment of his capital. While competition, therefore, constantly pursues him with its law of the cost of production and turns against himself every weapon that he forges against his rivals, the capitalist continually seeks to get the best of competition by restlessly introducing further subdivision of labor and new machines, which, though more expensive, enable him to produce more cheaply, instead of waiting until the new machines shall have been rendered obsolete by competition. If we now conceive this feverish agitation as it operates in the market of the whole world, we shall be in a position to comprehend how the growth, accumulation, and concentration of capital bring in their train an ever more detailed subdivision of labor, an ever greater improvement of old machines, and a constant application of new machine, a process of new machinery, a process which goes on uninterruptedly, with feverish haste, and upon an ever more gigantic scale. Wow, we've run into a few errors in this, like that one right there, new machine. A constant application of new machine. But what effect do these conditions, which are inseparable from the growth of productive capital, have upon the determination of wages? The greater division of labor enables one laborer to accomplish the work of 5, 10, or 20 laborers. It therefore increases competition among the laborers 5-fold, 10-fold, or 20-fold. The laborers compete not only by selling themselves one cheaper than the other, but also by one doing the work of 5, 10, or 20, and they are forced to compete in this manner by the division of labor, which is introduced and steadily improved by capital. Furthermore, to the same degree in which the division of labor increases, is the labor simplified. The special skill of the laborer becomes worthless. He becomes transformed into a simple, monotonous force of production, with neither physical nor mental elasticity. Obviously, there's a caveat here in this current iteration of capital where we see that there is either the addition or multiplication of labor also happening, where if you're not doing sort of this dumb menial sort of labor, then you have to know how to do like 50 people's jobs just to be able to outcompete people for one of those jobs that would pay something that's probably more like upper middle class. He becomes transformed into a simple, monotonous force of production with neither physical nor mental elasticity. His work becomes accessible to all, therefore competitors press upon him from all sides. Moreover, it must be remembered that the more simple, the more easily learned the work is, so much the less is its cost to production, the expense of its acquisition, and so much the lower must the wages sink. For, like the price of any other commodity, they are determined by the cost of production. Just think of people who are like on Fiverr right now offering their web designing or video editing services, and how cheap they are. You get these people who are like living in mommy and daddy's house or in the Philippines. So they're, what they need to make in terms of their, meeting their needs of their subsistence needs is less than a person who's trying to support a family. So the idea that you could support a family while doing freelance graphic design, video editing, or coding is greatly diminished, is it not? And that's because there's a bunch of people who are competing with you who are basically set up in their situation to be able to, even if, let's just say that they live in relative poverty in the Philippines, the point is that's relative poverty, and that the meeting their means of subsistence there is cheaper than a worker here, meaning that, the overall global market value of that labor power has been lowered because everyone's out competing each other to go as low as fucking possible, right? So like if a person like me builds a tiny house super cheap like this one, just to make it so that I don't have to pay as much rent, then I'm able to get by on less money, compensating my base needs of subsistence, meaning I have that extra money to do other stuff with. But that also means I can take a pay cut. That means that I can be more competitive with another worker who has a house and a family to support. So this is what we mean by abstract domination, when there are these system-wide global incentives in play to conduct your life in such a way. That means that your life world is structured by these factors that we've been talking about. I said something, I was making fun of, this is in casual conversation the other day, I was making fun of how some people use the word structural. They throw that around just to mean, well, your individual opinion doesn't matter because it's structural. And they just use that as a way to basically pull an ego sort of trip or power move in a social situation, as a way to try to argue that your intent or your belief doesn't really matter and that you really just need to shut the fuck up and toe the line that they are pushing. And that's a way of using the word structure that I do not like. And I said that, and someone who's just a regular working person who has happened to be in earshot of the conversation, a person who is not a geek or a nerd for any of the stuff that we're talking about, said, well, then what is a structure to me? Because here I am, talking shit about the way other people use the word. And I was like, oh, in my brain, I was like, oh, fuck. First of all, I'm high. I can't deal with this right now. Second of all, how do I explain this? And so, but you know, it's actually not too hard to explain. Your life and your ability to do things is framed, and any possibility that you can pursue is made more or less plausible against how much time and energy and attention you're able to give to different kinds of projects or relationships that you're trying to build in a week, in a month, in a year. And there is a way that politically and economically, your life world and your horizon of possibilities of what is considered plausible or not plausible is all structured by determinate material structures, what Marx would call like the productive conditions of your society. Meaning, my whole future and all of my possibilities are framed by the mere fact that I don't own any property and that I have nothing to trade but my future, my labor power, which I can only add value. I can only get more value for that labor power if I self-optimize myself to be more competitive in the labor market. So that means that everything I do in a week or in a month or in a year is measured by the law of value. How am I making myself exchangeable in that market? How am I self-optimizing myself to be more competitive against other workers? Studying philosophy, studying art, learning to play music, those don't make you more competitive. They might, in a sort of sense, it depends on your situation. They might make you a little bit more interesting. And if all you need to add to your portfolio or your resume or whatever is being a little bit more interesting, then who knows? Maybe you could justify it. But the point is, everything being in reference to the ability to sell oneself in a competitive market to someone who will purchase your future in exchange for wages or salary. That structures your reality. That structures your possibilities. That structures the way things are now and the way things can be. So that's how I explained it. And, it obviously is relevant to what we're talking about here, which, by the way, we're halfway through the last section. So we're almost done with this. We'll be done under 4 hours, which, it's not bad. Turns out you can actually listen to all of Marx's 1844 manuscripts, which include A Strange Labor, but a bunch of other sections as well. You can listen to it all in about 4 hours. I know this because I tried the other day. Value, Price, and Profit is a talk Marx gave to a bunch of workers at one of the international congresses, I think. And in that, he is also trying to make it as accessible as possible and try to give a whole picture of how everything works. So so Wage, Labor, and Capital, Value, Price, and Profit. These are the two most kind of recommended works that you go to as a sort of primer for, or as even a replacement to his later, more mature and fully elaborated works in Capital Volume 1, 2, and 3, or in the Grundrisse. So let's get back to it. The laborer seeks to maintain the total of his wages for a given time by performing more labor, either by working a great number of hours or by accomplishing more in the same number of hours. Thus, urged on by want, he himself multiplies the disastrous effects of division of labor. The result is, the more he works, the less wages he receives, and for this simple reason: the more he works, the more he competes against his fellow workmen, the more he compels them to compete against him and to offer themselves on the same wretched conditions as he does, so that in the last analysis he competes against himself as a member of the working class. Machinery produces the same effects, but upon a much larger scale. It supplants skilled laborers by unskilled, men by women, adults by children. Where newly introduced, it throws workers upon the streets in great masses, and as it becomes more highly developed and more productive, it discards them in additional, though smaller, numbers. Time energy sounds Sartre-esque. Interesting, Max. I read half of Being in Nothingness just looking for Sartre to talk about things kind of in a way that I was talking about them, but I really couldn't find him really getting into that. And it's really interesting because people like Emmanuel Levinas or Jean-Paul Sartre or Merleau-Ponty or Simone de Beauvoir, like all of them they're based in that sort of post-Heideggerian existential phenomenological approach as set out by Heidegger. And Heidegger is a sort of synthesis point between Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, Schopenhauer, Hegel, Kant, the classics, etc. Now, and Husserl, obviously. But the reason that I say all of that is just because I've read them all looking for something akin to time energy analysis or critique like I'm doing. And I did that for my thesis. But none of them really go in that direction. They all deal with different things. Sartre's more interested in freedom and responsibility. Merleau-Ponty's more interested in the body and perception. Emmanuel Levinas is more interested in ethics and the other and totalization or essentialism and how there's a sort of natural tendency or a sort of recurrent tendency in the human mode of perception and cognizance and communication to do this sort of essentializing, totalizing violence to the other. That's Levinas. Heidegger got closest to talking about time energy as the precondition, the existential phenomenological precondition for what becomes labor power under the sign of value, because he deconstructs the modernistic way of talking about time, where it is just assumed that time can be treated mathematically and logically, which is obviously true as a way of measuring base labor, right? Base labor time can be measured and labor power can be more or less calculated for capitalists using calendars and clocks and increasingly refined measurement systems for labor management. But Heidegger deconstructs in Being and Time. He deconstructs how time was being talked about by the moderns from Descartes through Kant, which is in part presumed by Marx as well. And all of the talk I do with horizons of possibility and actual finitude, like what's finite to you, your finite reserves, your finite possibilities, what's plausible more or less. That's the part of the analysis, the time energy analysis, that is bringing in Heidegger for me. And so that's all in my thesis, but it'll be in its more accessible version in the book soon, hopefully. We'll see. I'm supposed to have my book finished here in a month. It's crazy. So howdy, friends. Hi there. Hi, plebe. Jessidiah says, a simple, monotonous form of production. This is calling me out. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But also we're doing something new, aren't we? The fact that we're all working people. Well, I'm assuming that. I don't know about all of you, but but that more or less that we're all able to do simple, monotonous tasks, either working or playing video games while listening to someone who has put in a lot of effort to trying to understand something, then unpack it, making it therefore more accessible later whenever you will need to return to it. So, it's opening up new possibilities, that's for sure. We're definitely culture hacking our way towards new modes, sure, slowly but surely. Okay, back to it. Machinery produces the same effects, but upon a much larger scale. It supplants skilled laborers by unskilled, men by women. Oh yeah, the reason I wanted to touch back on this is because sometimes people are like, oh, look at Marx is sexist. Marx is so sexist because he thinks that it's bad that men are getting replaced by women. Fuck off. I swear to God. Jeez, I should probably try to be charitable to someone who would say such a thing, but I also just don't want to be. Getting children and women, if you replace, 3 hardworking men in a factory with 5 children and 2 women who can be paid a half or a third as much in wages to work as much or longer because they are less likely to stand up for themselves, to organize, to push back, to fight back, to demand higher wages, to participate in strikes, to, and if the engineers who are developing the equipment for the factory are designing them, they're using science to develop technologies to specifically cut out higher skilled people, as well as people who are traditionally probably approximately stronger in general, but also, traditionally saddled with the responsibility of providing for a household, and replacing those people with people who are not in that situation. That's fucked up. Like that's a scary tendency, and this is where conservatives could get together with liberals and probably agree that the family is being destroyed by a society that requires both parents to work, trading away most of their futures, neglecting their children, leaving their children to being raised by other people who are basically glorified babysitters in educational institutions for like the first 20 years of their lives, whatever. Yeah, if you think that women's liberation means women working in factories, then
Disgusting!
We have hastily sketched in broad outlines the industrial war of capitalists among themselves. This war has the peculiarity that the battles in it are won less by recruiting than by discharging the army of workers. The generals, the capitalists, vie with one another as to who can discharge the greatest number of industrial soldiers. The economists tell us, to be sure, that those laborers who have been rendered superfluous or extra by machinery find new venues of employment, right? So economists go, oh, it's fine, they'll go get a job somewhere else. They dare not assert directly that the same laborers that have been discharged find situations in new branches of labor. Wait, they dare not assert directly that the same laborers that have been discharged find situations in new branches of labor? Facts cry out too loudly against this lie. Strictly speaking, they only maintain that new means of employment will be found for other sections of the working class. For example, for the portion of the young generation of laborers who were about to enter upon the branch of industry which had just been abolished. So for instance, if someone's been farming or mining coal their whole life and now they're put out of business or they're laid off, the economists will typically be like, oh, well, they can get a job somewhere else. Okay, well, first of all, if they can, it probably pays less because they don't have the time, energy, attention, money, resources, or opportunities to be able to develop their skill sets fast enough to be able to take on some new career that would pay the same as what they were currently living at. And so they're going to see either a reduction or an early retirement, and probably early retirement, and they'll be fucked. And so we've seen a rising rate of farmer suicides ever since the 70s when the 1970s farming bill became the prerogative of that bill was go big or go home. And so farmers have become bureaucrats or they suffer and go out of existence. Bureaucrats, technicians, whatever, the farming gig. What I mean by being a bureaucrat or a technician means that your ability to succeed in farming at that large scale, when we're talking about going big or going, go big or go bust. When we say that, we're talking about people whose job just basically becomes overseeing machines, overseeing migrant workers who don't have like any sort of recognizable rights within our society or legal recourse to being exploited. We're talking about becoming managers and bureaucrats of capital instead of, and by the way, to banks. It's not like they're profiting personally very much, right? So what was a dignified sort of humble living is reduced to a sort of bureaucratic, technical position, being a manager of capital for banks. Of course, this is a great satisfaction to the disabled laborers. There will be no lack of fresh exploitable blood and muscle for the messers, capitalists. The dead may bury their dead. This consolation seems to be intended more for the comfort of the capitalists themselves than their laborers. If the whole class of wage labor were to be annihilated by machinery, how terrible that would be for capital, which, without wage labor, ceases to be capital. But even if we assume that all who are directly forced out of employment by machinery, as well as all of the rising generation